Picture a single line, cut clean across the prairie. One trail, one story, wagons rolling into a golden sunset. That picture is simple. The Oregon Trail was not. It began as a web of indigenous footpaths and animal tracks, worn deep long before any wagon wheel. Trappers and traders learned those paths for fur. Then a merchant named Robert Stewart followed one through the Rockies and found South Pass, a broad doorway in the mountains, a doorway wide enough for wheels. Now listen for the reasons people stepped through that door. Some heard a sermon about duty and destiny. Manifest Destiny promised purpose and it sounded holy. Some felt the panic of hard years in the East, with banks failing and stores boarded up. Land in Oregon was said to be rich and waiting. Later, a law promised free acres to a husband and wife who would build a home there. Politicians saw something else. If more Americans lived in Oregon country, the map would lean their way. In 1846, a treaty with Britain fixed a line and made that claim real. The trail that followed did not look like a road. It was a long chain of choices. Ruts along the Platte River, landmarks shaped by wind, named by travellers who needed names. Chimney Rock pointing like a finger. Independence Rock holding 1,000 carved dates. The Snake River boiling in spring. Forts that were not castles, just lifelines where you could buy flour, trade a rifle, mend a wheel. West of the Blue Mountains, you face the Dalles and a decision. Trust a raft and the river, or pay for Barlow Road and circle around the volcano. Every choice carried a cost, in money, in time, in risk. The greatest danger was not a raid in the night. It was a cup dipped in the wrong water. Cholera moved faster than a wagon team and hit harder than any ambush. Dysentery, measles, smallpox, fever. An axle could snap. A child could slip under a wheel. A river could take a team and the grain with it. Most people walked to spare the oxen. Women hauled fuel, boiled water, kept children alive, men set fords, lifted spokes, paced the miles. Many would arrive, many would not. There is another side to the road. For native nations, this was not a frontier opening. It was a home crossed, a river crowded, a fish run thinned, a graveyard widened by foreign disease. Friendships and trade did happen. So did fear, anger, and war. After a sickness-swept mission, the chaos struck back. Years later, far away on the plains, soldiers would fire on families at Wounded Knee. Memory holds both kindness and loss. We will not turn away from either. This series will follow the trail and test the myths. We will hold a wheel rim to the light and ask where it first turned. We will unfold a paper map and circle South Pass with a pencil. We will lift an iron spike and listen to the hammer that ended the wagon era. We will set a silver $50 beside a museum tag, and then we will wake an old computer and watch a green cursor blink. You have died of dysentery became a joke line in a game. It was also a sentence on real graves. Across our hours together, the aim is clear. Compare the story you learned with the record people left. Diaries, treaties, laws, place names scratched into rock. We will keep the sentences plain and the objects close at hand. If a fact is sharp, we will not sand it down. If a myth is lovely, we will test it anyway. Tradition can hold more than one truth at once. Take a breath. Feel the ground underfoot. The trail we follow is long, but the ruts are still there. We will step into them, one careful mile at a time. Lay the map flat on a table and smooth the fold with your palm. The ink is pale, the paper foxed at the edges, the shapes of rivers and ranges sketched with a steady hand. In the upper centre, a thin ellipse is circled. A doorway in the mountains labelled with a neat block script, South Pass. You have heard the simpler story, the clean line cut by wagons and will. The truth begins here instead, with a pass already worn by many feet before any pencil could name it. The Oregon Trail did not start as a road. It started as memory stored in the land. The first paths ran with the seasons and the herds. Hoof and heel made the routes and every rise had a reason. Valleys opened not because someone explored them for the first time, but because water and wind and snow had taught generations where a person could safely move. Indigenous nations used this knowledge the way you use a compass, not as a novelty but as a necessity. Trails were not declared. They were maintained by walking them. They were described in stories and place names, then confirmed by what your own eyes could read on the ground. A single cottonwood marks a ford. A notch on a ridge means shelter from a storm. You do not need a milestone if your landscape is already a library. When foreigners first entered that library, they did so for profit, not for pilgrimage. Early in the 19th century, trappers and traders from England, from France, and from the United States followed the same paths to seek one specific pelt. Beaver filled hats and collars in European cities and turned cold rivers into counting rooms. The fur trade moved men across the high plains and into the basins that fed the Rocky Mountains. They did not invent the ways through. They learned them. They paid for directions with tobacco and trade goods, or simply watched the ground where the earth had already been pressed smooth. In 1812, a small party left the Pacific coast, carrying news and needs back toward the Missouri. Among them was a merchant named Robert Stewart. He did not carry a grand plan. He carried a practical question. How do you cross the spine of a continent with baggage and hope still intact? The answer, when he found it, did not look dramatic. It looked like distance made gentle. The pass he crossed sits at about 7,550 feet. Compared to the sharp teeth of other rocky gaps, it is broad and almost level. A wagon would not scrape its undercarriage there. Hooves would not slide on a cliff's edge. You could set a steady pace and keep it. This was the discovery that mattered, and it did not glitter. It simply worked. Think about what a doorway does. It does not push you across. It gives you the option and makes it realistic. South Pass was that option in the middle of a range that defeated heavy wheels. When the news filtered back east, it changed the map in people's minds before it changed any atlas. The high mountains no longer felt like a wall. They felt like a place you could pass if you chose your line and your season. The trail still remained a chain of choices, but a crucial link was now firm. The pass alone did not create a trail. Trails are not single strokes. They are habits. For years after Stewart's crossing, the high country saw more rawhide packs than family wagons. Men in pairs or small bands moved from fort to fort, or from rendezvous to rendezvous, speaking a jargon of French, English, and dozens of indigenous words. They knew where to find willow for repair, where to ford a river even when it looked angry, and who might trade beaver tails for flour. They widened some segments by repetition. They overlapped others because snow and flood remade the land each spring. A traveller then would have seen not one road but a braid of ruts and footpaths, splitting and rejoining like water. If you're used to highways, this braid feels like confusion. If you're honest about the West, it looks like accuracy. The West did not welcome uniformity. It allowed passage when you respected its limits. On the ground, the rule was simple. Follow water when you can, because water means grass and grass keeps oxen alive. Avoid steep grades if you have wheels. Accept a long curve if it saves animals and axles. These rules made the old network legible to new travellers who cared more about arriving than about drawing a straight line. That is one myth loosened. The trail was never a single track chiselled into stone by pioneers with iron will. It was a living route made durable by use. The next myth waits beside it and ties to motive. You may have heard that people moved west because they were bold by nature. Some were, certainly. Many also moved because their world back east tilted and cracked. But before the tilting and the cracks, before a law-promised acres and a map gained a border, there was a frame of belief that turned a long trip into a moral sentence. We will arrive at that frame and at the winters that made it compelling. Stay with the map a little longer first, because the person who unfolded it today also has to reframe the first page. Think again about how Stewart's discovery sits in time. The year matters, because it places the doorway well ahead of the great waves of family wagons. This is essential when you test the story that the trail was made all at once by a sudden rush. It was not. The knowledge of the paths existed, circulated slowly, then gathered speed as different needs aligned. That alignment depended on more than geography. It depended on a political rivalry along a far coast and on sermons that sounded like manifest purpose. It also depended on letters home from people who had made the trip and found soil that matched the promises printed on broadsides. Before those letters, before those proclamations, the resources that would later be used to sell the West were catalogued by professional eyes. Traders already knew where the rivers ran thick with fish, where game kept a valley stocked, where grass cured sweet. Indigenous communities already knew where winter burns could be set to renew a meadow, and where a salmon run could feed a village. These facts were not secret, just they were systems, and they made the region habitable to the people who lived there. Later, the same facts would be repurposed and renamed as assets for an incoming population. This is not an accusation. It is an observation that helps you see continuity through the change of labels. Our map is still on the table. A finger traces east from the pass, down the slope of a continent toward places you already know by other names. Independence on the Missouri. St. Joseph, Council Bluffs. It will be years before many wagons roll from those towns toward that circle in the Rockies, but the path between them has been reduced from difficult to possible. Possibility is oxygen. Add it to hunger and doctrine and you will see fire. Keep the pencil where the land stays high. Notice how the Continental Divide is not a single blade, but a spread of ridges and basins. South Pass crosses that divide at a place where the world seems to flatten. The person who first wrote that down did not need poetry. They needed plain words that would convince a skeptical freight owner that his wagons could make it. They wrote about gradient and distance and the way the wind felt on the face. They wrote about a trail wide enough to ride 2 horses abreast. They wrote about seeing the horizon without a cliff breaking it. Those notes set a tone for the documents that would follow. Quiet. Practical words make people move more than slogans do. A caution belongs here. Do not flatten the past into an arrow that only goes one way. The same past that let wagons go west also let trade and news travel east. People on both sides of the line used it, and the line itself did not exist yet on any official paper. The later border would depend on a treaty signed in 1846. You can see how that story pulls us forward into politics and numbers. For the moment, it is enough to say that when a route becomes reliable, more than one interest claims it. More than one story will try to own it. Now set the map aside for a moment and think about the body. A road is abstract until a pair of legs uses it. The early trappers walked, rode, and waded. They carried loads you would not choose, but they carried them because the trade paid. The benefit of the past to them was obvious. It saved time. It saved horses. It saved lives on bad days when a misstep would otherwise mean a fall no one could stop. When families began to imagine themselves on the same ground, they translated those savings into different terms. An easier crossing meant fewer broken axles and fewer exhausted oxen. It meant a mother could focus on keeping her child warm instead of counting switchbacks with dread. It meant a father could tally flour and bacon with enough confidence to set off in April and trust a September arrival. Geography turns into calendar and then into plan. At this early point you might expect a sudden wave, a season when 1,000 wagons creaked forward together. The reality was slower. Travellers watch each other. Someone goes first, then writes. Someone reads, then weighs the letter against a neighbour's doubt. A preacher speaks about a mission on the far edge. A politician mentions the map in a speech. A merchant returns with a story that sounds like an advertisement and also like a warning. There is a cadence to how a frontier becomes familiar. It repeats the same small actions until they feel normal. The past that began as a singular circle on a hand-drawn sheet becomes a word held in common. Everyone understands it the way townsfolk understand the name of the nearest bridge. It is a piece of daily speech, and that is when movement accelerates. We will turn these notes into a clear picture soon. We will name the reasons why the idea of crossing hardened into a decision. We will talk about a belief that wore the clothes of faith and the voice of law. We will talk about the winters back east that ate savings and patience and pushed people to consider an exit. We will talk about the promise of land measured in acres that you could call your own. But a good explanation begins with what your feet will touch. Before you board a ferry or yoke an ox, you want to know where the ground rises and where it eases. South Pass is the hinge. The door swings on it. Take one more look at the map and notice that its edges are smudged. Many hands have turned these corners. A child once drew a crude wagon in the margin. An older hand penciled a list of names to send letters to if the party did not arrive by autumn. The artifact reminds you that even accurate facts feel human when they are written in a human way. That is why we are keeping this object in view as our guide. Each time a claim is tested, each time a myth is weighed, we will return to something you can hold. The point of a comparison is not to scold an earlier story. It is to replace a single line with a model that matches the terrain. A voice in a room far from the plains once said that a continent was meant to be filled. That statement makes sense in a debate. It does not tell you where to refill your water barrels or how to avoid bogging your wheels. The people who first took the Oregon route seriously learned to carry both kinds of knowledge. The large words you print on a broadsheet tell you why you might endure a hard trip. The small words on a folded map tell you how. When a tradition survives, it is because it keeps both scales in balance. When you come back to the table next time, the pencil will move faster. We will draw arrows that start in river towns along the Missouri and bend toward that circle in the mountains. We will write short phrases in the margins that name the forces pulling those arrows west. The ink will note a financial panic in one year and a harsher one in another. A neat hand will add a claim of free acres under a federal act that turned a dream into a ledger entry. A careful script will spell out a word that framed all of it as destiny. For now, let the paper rest under your palm and feel the grain of the fibres. The pass is marked. The door stands open. The reasons to walk toward it are gathering, just off the edge of the page. Keep the map open. The circle around South Pass holds steady while the reasons to reach it multiply. You can feel the change in weight. A route becomes a plan when belief, policy, and hunger begin to rhyme. The myth says courage alone cut the trail. The truth is quieter. Courage met arithmetic, headlines, and a theology of direction. The West turned from horizon into objective because many small levers moved at once, and they all pointed the same way. Start with the lever people name first. Manifest Destiny did not invent geography. It gave language to an urge already present and made that urge sound sanctified. Politicians spoke of duty and fate. Editors stitched the words into banners and repeated them until they seemed self-evident. Ministers said the work of settlement could be work for God. Those phrases did not turn wagon wheels by themselves. They did something subtler. They framed a family choice as a national act and made the long walk feel like service. When an idea tells you that forward is righteous, the drag of fear softens a little. Now set the belief against a map owned by two powers at once. The Oregon country stood under joint occupation by the United States and Britain. That arrangement looked tidy on paper and tenuous on the ground. Numbers would decide the argument long before diplomats did. More American households in the valleys would strengthen a future claim. Leaders in Washington understood that logic. They did not need to say it aloud to every voter. Encouraging settlement served both the story of destiny and the math of sovereignty. In time, the Treaty of 1846 defined the line, and the southern portion fell under American control. The circle around South Pass did not move, but its meaning for one government changed. A door in the mountains now opened into a room your politicians meant to furnish. Belief and rivalry make the wind blow in one direction. Wind alone does not feed a family. Eastern banks failed, harvests stalled, stores closed. The year 1837 is written in ledgers, not sermons, and its shock rippled forward. Again in 1841 prospects cracked for many who thought their footing was firm. Farms lost credit. Labourers lost wages. When a house begins to lean, the idea of leaving it no longer sounds reckless. People turned eyes toward a place where land was said to be generous and the cost of entry, at least in money, was low. A crisis does not build a wagon. It makes a list. Flour, bacon, a barrel for water, tools for fence and roof. If you can price these things and lay them beside your current debts, you can decide. Many did. Hear the counterpoint that arrived a few years later. A federal statute promised acreage, not in a whisper, but in the clear voice of law. The Donation Land Act of 1850 offered a specific gift to a specific kind of household. A white man or a person of mixed ancestry could claim 160 acres, and his wife could claim another 160. The promise did not recognize all who lived in the region already. It treated land as space-awaiting paper, not as home with other names. Within its narrow terms, it offered certainty. It turned vaguer hopes into lines on a survey and numbers in a deed. If you were a farmer with sons and little chance to buy back east, this law looked like a key left under a mat. You could imagine where to build a cabin. You could see wheat taking hold past the door. Marketing followed law the way water follows a slope. Pamphlets praised soil that never seemed to tire. Letters home did not read like poems. They read like proofs. A neighbour wrote that the ground near the Willamette took the plough and gave back more than he had seen in Ohio. A brother wrote that timber stood close and straight enough for any roof. A cousin wrote that winters felt different, and that a person with a strong back could get ahead. News like that makes belief practical. It is easier to endure a day of dust if a relative has measured a field and told you the count of furrows. It is easier to square hardship with purpose when a statute guarantees something solid at the end. Religion acted as spark and as bridge. Missionaries sent home reports that mixed faith with agriculture and travel detail. A man wrote of a small chapel and a larger meadow. A woman described teaching children and growing beans. Names like Jason Lee and Marcus Whitman passed back through the post. and then across parlours by word of mouth. The letters did not hide the distance. They testified that the distance could be crossed. If you were wavering, a packet of pages from someone who had stood under the same sky you hoped to see did more than a newspaper column ever could. It added a human scale to a continental plan. Not every traveller sought a farm at the end of the road. Some sought quiet. The path carried groups who wanted relief from punishment at home as much as they wanted land abroad. The Mormon migration turned a branch of the larger network toward the basin where they could build without the old harassments. That decision drew on the same knowledge of rivers, grades, and seasons. It was driven by a different need. The point stands. The Oregon route and its companions were not only pipes that poured farm families into valleys, they were corridors for many kinds of resolve. The story of money turned more dramatic near decade's end. In the late 1840s, gold drew attention like a bell. It rang from California, and the sound carried all the way to river towns on the Missouri. Thousands counted tools and days and turned their wheels toward the same horizon because the promise was immediate. The Oregon Trail and its branches served that rush. The intent differed from the farmer's patient plan. The road did not care. Its ruts accepted both tempos. Oxen pulled men who meant to claim a section and sow seed next spring. Oxen also pulled men who meant to sift gravel within weeks and come home fast with pockets hot. Either way, traffic thickened and the thread of habit became a cable. Stack these motives and see how they interlock. Manifest Destiny carried the tone of a hymn that could steady a heart when a river ran cold. Political rivalry supplied a timetable and a motive larger than any one family. Economic shocks pushed people off porches and into wagons by making the status quo untenable. A land law promised a clear reward for the long walk. Missionary letters offered ground truth. Religious flight used the same corridor to reach a different refuge. Gold cut the last strand of hesitation for many who might otherwise have stayed. None of these alone would have filled a valley. Together they changed the arithmetic of staying put. Now return the pencil to the map and begin to mark origins. Independence sits on the page like a hinge between old life and new. St. Joseph and Council bluffs share that role. Wagons did not roll year-round. Departure windows mattered more than slogans. You had to leave after the prairie greened enough to feed animals, and before mountain snow shut the door. People learned these rules by bitter example, then wrote them down for neighbours. Belief could tell you that you were meant to go. Practice told you when. The myth prefers a cleaner line. It says a family woke, pointed west, and the land yielded like a plan drawn by Providence. The map and the letters say something humbler. Families argued around table and fire. They weighted debt against rumour and rumour against law. They sold what they could not carry and packed what would be too heavy by the third week. They yoked oxen, then unharnessed them when frost returned late one spring and made grass scarce. They waited, then tried again. The Oregon Trail did not reward the rigid. It rewarded the patient and those who listened. Go because others go, a handbill urged in a script that felt friendly. Go because you must, a preacher added with a look that felt stern. The truth sat between those sentences and did not need italics. People went because staying had stopped making sense. They went because they had a pass through the high country and a law at the far end. They went because someone they trusted had gone and wrote back that the earth accepted the plough. They went because the idea of a continent shaped for their purpose felt large enough to hold their risks. None of this erases the harm to those who were already there. That part of the story will have its own table and its own map. For now the script stays with the minds of those who walked, because the reasons in those minds built the daily motion we will soon follow. Do not imagine that belief erased fear. Fear travelled inside every wagon. It showed itself when a child coughed on a cold morning and would not drink. It showed itself when a river turned brown and quick and the current ate a cartwheel. It showed itself in the pause at a ridge when the wind pushed hard enough to make a person kneel beside a yoke and breathe. In those moments, the grand sentences about destiny shrank. What remained useful were the practical gifts given by earlier travellers. Where to ford, where to wait out squall, where to cut willows for a repair, and where to boil water because sickness moves in what looks clean. The Oregon story keeps its scale only if it preserves these small answers alongside the loud ones. Set a small scene in a kitchen east of the Missouri. A father opens a handbill and traces a list with his finger. A mother turns a letter from cousins out west over twice and weighs her own sentences before she says them aloud. If we go together, she says, steady as she can manage. A teenager measures the doorframe with a piece of twine to remember the height of a sister who will stay. The family's braveries are private. The nation will call them instruments of a plan. On this page, they look like people choosing in the space that crises and policies made possible. The rivalry with Britain gave these private choices an extra gravity. Every new American cabin south of a line not yet drawn pressed a thumb on the scale. Settlement argued where diplomats later wrote, "When the treaty set the boundary in 1846, it recognised what population had already made clear. Power arranges maps, but people fill them. That is why leaders had urged migration years earlier. They did not need to invent a story about holy purpose to see the practical advantage. The story and the advantage marched together and left the same footprints. Law continued to shape who followed. The Donation Land Act's arithmetic favoured particular households and left others outside. It multiplied incentives for couples to marry and travel while the offer held. It turned women into named stakeholders in a way that also served a dimension of policy. More families meant a different kind of permanence than mining camps could boast. Fields and schoolhouses make a claim visibly harder to dislodge than tents and prospect holes. Write that down in the margin. Policy did not only reward movement, it designed the kind of community that would greet the surveyor. You can map belief and law and money. You should also mark the sending of information back along the same path. Letters did as much work as wagons. They corrected exaggerations and created new ones. A man bragged about crop yields because bragging is human. He also warned his brother about a river crossing because caution is human. The exchange made the next departure both more likely and more measured. Over a few years, the braid of old indigenous paths took on a new rhythm. Rendezvous for fur became rendezvous for food and repairs. A fort that once served pelts now served bacon and axle grease. None of this required a single heroic inventor. It required repetition, memory, and a calendar everyone learned to respect. The gold news did not erase farming plans. It ran alongside them like a fast creek beside a slower one. Some families lost a son to the sparkle and gained him back 2 years later, leaner and ready to plant where the ground asked for patience. Others followed the gleam all the way, then stayed in new towns that rose to feed the mines. The Oregon route and its spurs absorbed both choices. If you listen closely to the sound of wagon tires on dried mud, you hear ambition and necessity in equal measure. The national story later emphasized one voice at a time to make neat sense. The ground held both. Is it really that far? A child asked in a doorway, staring at a map she could not scale. It is far enough to change us, a parent said, which was the most honest answer available. That change was not only personal, it shaped who held which field, which language named a river, which law decided a dispute. It shaped who was counted and who was made invisible on paper. The belief that expansion brought progress carries a heavy price tag on its reverse side. We will turn that tag over with care. Before we have to finish laying out how the movement gathered, because the force of it matters when we measure the damage it did to others. The pencil hovers over the Missouri again. The line to the mountains is still only faint graphite, but the reasons are now written clearly around it. Destiny gives meaning. Rivalry gives urgency. Panic gives push. A land grant gives shape. Letters give proof. Faith gives courage. Gold gives speed. Together they harden a family's yes into a date on a calendar and a list of supplies on a table. You can almost hear the chores begin. Barrels scrubbed, wheels checked, a crib modified to fit a wagon bed, fire irons wrapped in cloth so they do not rattle, small domestic sounds preparing to meet a long horizon. Look once more at the circle around South Pass. Earlier, it meant possibility. Now, with the motives stacked, it means permission. Not divine permission in the sermon sense, though many heard it that way. Practical permission. You can go, and if you go at the right time and follow water and avoid steep grades, you stand a good chance to arrive. That combination of confidence and caution is what turns rumour into travel. The map is almost ready to be inked with a route instead of dotted fantasies. We will soon draw a thin track from a river town to the Platte and up toward the open country. We will name the first few places where a scattered crowd becomes a moving community. We will listen for the moment when separate wagons choose to keep the same pace and share the same camp circle. The objects on the table will change too. The list of reasons will slide under the map, and a smaller list will rise in front. Grass, water, grade, leave in spring, boil water, keep children away from wheels, Sleep while you can. The idea of destiny will not vanish. It will step back to make room for routines learned one slow mile at a time. Keep the map ready. The lines are about to become roads you can follow with your finger. The voices that urge the move will recede as wagon leaders take over the talking. The circle at South Pass will still be there, calm as ever, waiting to become a date in a diary and a gentle slope underfoot. We will take the first miles together next, starting where river towns empty into prairies and names like Fort Kearney turn into useful pauses on a long plan. The page is prepared. The pencil waits. Keep the map on the table. The circle in Wyoming has already changed from rumour to waypoint. The last task before we move our finger west is to convert belief into practice. That step is less grand than any speech and more decisive than any slogan. It turns a family's yes into dates, distances, and chores. It is where a national story squeezes down into a wagon box. Start with the clock. The trail is long, about 2,170 miles by the best estimates carried in letters. The walk usually takes 4 to 6 months if weather and luck hold. Those numbers translate into a departure window that matters more than inspiration. You leave after spring grass can feed oxen and before mountain snow will refuse you. If you try to shave those boundaries, you gamble against grass or ice and both tend to win. So the calendar becomes your first tool. Men may argue about destiny. Animals do not. They graze, drink, and sleep. You build your plan around that truth because a wagon without its team is only a wooden room that will not move. Look next at the human habit of gathering. The trail does not start as a road painted across a continent. It begins as a set of river towns where choices converge. Independence on the Missouri carries the romance of a name. So does St. Joseph. Council Bluffs holds the same role. Families from different counties and states drift toward these hinges because boats and ferries place them there, and because merchants near the docks have learned which goods a westbound mind will buy. It is not heroic to purchase flour, bacon, and tools. It is necessary. Guides warn against overload. Most travellers will walk to spare the animals. A child who hears that rule believes the adults are joking. By the second week, the joke fades and the rule becomes rhythm. Now draw a thin track with your pencil to Fort Kearney. The post sits out on the prairie where many threads tighten into one cord. You can feel that change even on paper. Ahead, famous rocks and gate-like canyons will look like scenes from a catechism of westering. For now, the land is open and broad, and the community forms because single wagons prefer company. Company shares the burden of watching the herd. Company spreads the chance of repair. Company brings a few extra eyes to spot the safest place to ford when a river runs high and brown. The myth prefers a solitary silhouette against sunset. Diaries describe circles of wagons and voices agreeing on pace. It is also at these early camps that the great abstract motives step back. Manifest destiny made speeches possible. Treaty talk set boundaries. Panic made staying expensive in more ways than one. A land grant promised reward at journey's end. Letters proved both soil and distance. None of that decides who walks point at first light, or who fills the water cask, or where to stack the grain sacks so they will not crush the cast iron. Those decisions fall to people who can listen and then act. They look for someone calm enough to set rules without swagger. They settle on a basic order so that the faster do not run the animals ragged and the slower do not feel shamed. A column that ignores these quiet agreements will scatter before the first hills. We leave at sunup, a leader says. Voice, even. We halt at noon for shade and grass. There is comfort in that economy. People who lost money in banks and stores now possess 10 sentences that can carry them a day forward. 10 sentences repeated 6 days in a row become a week. A few of those weeks become the first third of the journey. Numbers like that explain more movement than any hymn can. Keep a thumb on the circle around South Pass while we name the other early facts. The path that will lead there did not spring from American invention. It followed older tracks laid by hooves and repeated by indigenous feet. This admission does not weaken the pioneer story. It grounds it. To pretend the land had no lines before 1840 is to insult the land. The families now packing butter, churns and seed sacks will add their wear to routes that already fitted the terrain. They will widen some sections and carve ruts into clay that hold rain like shallow troughs. They will also learn to respect the old logic of water, grass, and grade. A man who ignores that logic because a speechmaker told him he is part of a destiny will become an example in someone else's cautionary letter. Preparation becomes its own kind of argument. A neighbour suggests taking a piano because Glory will need a soundtrack. A woman smiles and rests a palm on the wagon tongue. She knows the weight without looking. We will sing, she answers, soft and plain. Humour keeps pride from taking the reins. A list folds into quarters and tucks into a pocket. Rope for repairs, needles and thread. Extra shoes for children who will try to walk barefoot until heat burns a lesson into their steps. The kit for boiling water because the invisible enemy loves a clear stream and a careless thirst. Even in this opening stage, fear is not something you silence by force. It is something you respect and fit into routine. Information flows both ways across the plains. Outfitters near the river have learned to translate news into advice. They talk about the forts that will matter, and about the long stretch beside the Platte where banks can crumble under a wheel. They warn that the road does not fork neatly like a town street. Cut-offs tempt the impatient with the promise of saved miles bought with lost water. The most travelled path is the one that keeps to river and grass as if both were commandments. If you doubt that, ask any teamster who ever watched an ox put its face into a stream and drink as if the day were a miracle ending well. The first days out of independence can feel like a holiday. Spirits are high. Children race the wagons until a parent calls them back and points at the wheels. The warning is quiet because the danger is simple. The distance between steel rim and earth is narrow. A stumble at the wrong moment ends badly. Nothing about destiny corrects a misstep near a turning wheel. That is why the early camps repeat the same litany at dusk. Keep hands clear. Keep matches dry. Do not step in the dark without a lantern. It sounds like a schoolhouse list until someone breaks a rule, and the lesson becomes more expensive than anyone wanted. You can hear a second kind of conversation rising too. A few men talk about pace as if miles were a contest. Another replies with the calendar in his voice. Grass is our fuel, he says. We are not racing a neighbour. We are racing a season. The words hang in the air because they hold the thing everyone senses. The Rockies do not move. Snow will come. A pass that feels like a meadow in August can turn to a wall for 5 months. Make peace now with the truth that you are not stronger than winter. Make a plan that arrives before it. Belief remains present, but in a different register. It blesses the small decisions once they are made. It does not make the decisions for you. The family that prays before sleep also checks the wheel hubs for heat. The one does not cancel the other. Both are ways of caring for people you love while you ask a lot from them. A sermon may have started the discussion. A ledger settled it. A list keeps it going. Back to the map for a moment. Our pencil line runs clean from a river town to Fort Kearney. Beyond that point, it will pass known stone sentinels and slide toward Wyoming's open pass. The temptation is to skip ahead. Resist that urge. The first 200 miles teach habits that will govern the next 2,000. They are also a kind of vow to the animals whose bodies pull this plan from idea into motion. You begin to understand the shape of a day. Morning chill, mid-morning chatter, noon quiet, late light that softens edges. Then the cooking smoke that sets a camp smell people will remember 50 years later. In that memory are facts. A child coughing near a pot where water rolls, a woman cutting bacon into a pan, counting pieces because rationing starts right away, a man testing a rope with his palm to read its wear. These scenes are the beads of big history threads onto its string. Myth wants each bead to gleam the same way. Reality insists on variety. One wagon carries a family fleeing an eastern collapse. Another carries a family drawn by the promise of land made very specific by law. Another carries a brother who dreams of panning in a western river before turning north, to settle in a valley that a cousin praised in a letter. The road admits all these motives and converts them into the same forward motion. When two wagons meet, they do not compare philosophies. They compare axle pins. There is a gentler myth that also needs trimming. It says everything important happened on the move. In fact, the decision to move was the act that moved the most weight. It rested on data more than daydream. News of joint occupation with Britain and then the treaty line in 1846 told people their claims would have a particular government behind them. A land grant in 1850 wrote acres into a ledger beside a man's name and his wife's as well. The economy east of the Missouri made staying feel like risk, not safety. Missionary letters added measurements to the idea of a future. All that arithmetic sits under the canvas cover from the first mile. It is heavy and useful. At night, someone walks a few yards away from the circle and looks up. Stars over the plains can make a person feel both blessed and small. Do you think there will be a schoolhouse? A child asks, sleepy. If we build one, comes the answer. That line tells the truth about the journey. It does not deliver a finished life at the end. It delivers a place where a life can be built within a legal frame that did not exist on paper 20 years earlier. That promise carries its own shadows, because others already called the place home and their claims were not treated with the same care. Our next steps will keep that in view. For now, the new community forming around the campfire has to master this early stretch, where the land rolls and the rivers run wide and the temptation to treat the trail like a parade remains strong. Dawn seeps into the prairie the way tea seeps into water. The leader gives a low whistle, oxen shift and blow. A mother checks the lashings that hold a cradle to the wagon's interior wall. A father tightens a strap over a barrel that has begun to work loose. Two neighbours trade a look that says they will share watch duties tonight. Company is not romance. It is cheap insurance that pays out in quiet ways. When a wheel creaks wrong for the first time, a second man hears it as well. When a cloud bank suggests a storm at mid-afternoon, a woman in one camp sees the same signs her friend in the next wagon sees. Consensus travels faster than any single warning would. Preparation turns into movement with no ceremony. There is no grand ribbon to cut, no drum roll. Hooves fall, wheels turn, and the grass bends back. The map on the table slides under a hand to keep it from fluttering. The circle around South Pass waits, but other names will come first. Courthouse Rock and Jail Rock, Chimney Rock, a great Independence Rock that will teach people how to mark their presence without carving anything cruel. Those names belong to what comes after Fort Kearney. They are the chorus that joins a melody already begun. Walk at the oxen's pace. A voice reminds a boy who has started to skip. He falls in, breath short but proud. He understands that the pace is not an insult to his energy. It is a way to make sure he sees the far mountains up close instead of from a distance he never closes. That lesson is the last one this opening chapter needed to teach. Endurance works better than display. The day warms. A few wagons fan out and then draw back in because the leaders have agreed to stay close enough for a circle at night. The future holds gambles that will test that decision. A cut-off will promise speed and invite thirst. A river will promise quick crossing and hide a hole. A hill will promise a view and cost a wheel. Those details belong to miles we have not yet traced. We will get there by keeping our attention clean now. The pencil lifts from the circle and returns to the line near Independence. That is the right place to pause. We have turned motives into rules and lists, and rules into the first steady miles. The ruts ahead were made by others, but will deepen under these wheels. The myths that crowd the subject have loosened their hold a little, replaced by work that fits the shape of a day. The map is ready for landmarks and junctions, for forts that feed travellers and for choices that test judgment. In the next stretch, the river will be our companion, and stone towers will rise on the horizon like bookmarks placed by earlier hands. Listen for water, faint and constant, as if the paper itself were remembering the Platte. That sound, even imagined, is better than any anthem for what comes next. It will lead us north and west toward the first real gates of rock, toward a past that looks like a meadow and saves lives by being ordinary, and toward a moment when wagons must decide between the sweep of a dangerous river and a toll road that cuts around a mountain. Keep the map flat. Keep the pencil sharp. We move at first light. Set the compass beside the packing list and listen to. The lie it corrects. The lie says there was one clean road west, a single thread drawn across a blank nation. The compass knows better. It points, then waits. Because the Oregon Trail is not a line, but a braid. Paths split, wander toward water, and return like strands finding each other after miles. The map you imagined at home turns messy within days. Choice replaces certainty. Judgment replaces rumour. The first certainty is water, so people gather where river towns touch the plains. Independence on the Missouri becomes a harbour for wheels. Joseph and Council Bluffs play the same part. Busy mouths opening onto grass seas. Sacked flour rests beside bacon and spare yolks. Iron hoops stack near barrels that will leak if not trained with pitch and patience. Outfitters offer advice that sounds like law because experience wrote it first. Keep loads lighter than your pride. Walk more than you ride. Let oxen set the day's pace, not your eagerness. The list on the wagon bow grows smudged by thumbs repeating those lessons. Within a week, traces from many towns merge toward Fort Kearney. You do not see the fort at first. You feel the pull. Wagons that left separate ferries drift closer as if gravity were social. The open prairie encourages company. Tens become scores. Scores become a train by nothing more dramatic than shared routine. Dawn signals harness. Noon calls shade and grass. Dusk demands a circle tight enough to speak from wagon to wagon without shouting. Myth prefers a lone silhouette against the last light. Daily work prefers neighbours who trade watch and lend tools. Fort Kearney marks the first hinge where hesitation turns into route. It was placed to be found, and it is a cluster of roofs, a parade ground scuffed by hooves, a flag that takes on the role of reassurance more than decoration. Messages arrive here carried by people coming east and people who change their minds. The news is practical. The river ahead runs broad but shallow most days. Banks sheer where buffalo and wagons have softened clay. Grass grows thick enough to tempt a halt, but mosquitoes float in its shade. The world wearies you by offering both comfort and cost in the same handful of miles. Leave the fort and the land begins to show its teachers. Courthouse Rock and Jail Rock rise from the Nebraska plain like verdicts cast in stone. They are named by settlers who could not resist metaphors that turn geology into buildings. A child points and asks if people carved them. The mother smiles and says the wind and rain did, steady as patience. Will we sleep under them tonight? The child whispers. We will sleep where the oxen say stop, comes the answer. Their shapes become reassurance, visible all afternoon, holding direction without words. Soon Chimney Rock appears, a spire against a flat horizon. It announces itself long before you reach it. Diaries call it a promise and a tease. You walk for hours and it seems no closer. Your feet learn a western truth. Distance on the plains is different from distance among hills. Air is clear enough to pull landmarks forward and then refuse them. The wagon train adjusts by counting time instead of inches. Noon, 1, noon, 2. A river crossing breaks the spell because water ignores illusions. It is either fordable or it is not. When it is high and brown, patience earns more than courage. When it slackens, current still wants to steal a wheel. Ropes and shouts, drivers and swimmers, all in the same careful dance. Between these rock tutors, the Platte runs like a shallow ribbon cut wide. Its channels braid and separate, mirroring the trail itself. You could wade most of it on a hot day, if you did not mind mud that welcomes ankles too easily. The river's presence does more than ease thirst. It names the route. Stay near grass and water. The rule seems childish until someone breaks it for ambition. An ox's ribs tell you the bill long before your ledger does. You become, without realizing it, devoted to the ugly wisdom of repeatable choices. Independence Rock waits in Wyoming like a whale beached in sage. People like to carve names on its shell. They stand on stone that will outlast their barns and scratch letters that might outlast their children's bones. The act is both vanity and prayer. Here I was. They write, so that someone later may know they were not a rumour. The rock's name both honours and complicates its role. It offers a moment of independence from doubt, a place where the land itself testifies that hundreds have stood here and then continued. It also reminds you, quietly, that independence works best with involuntary order. The circle of wagons proves that every evening, a canyon pinches next, called Devil's Gate because the river knifes through it with a taste for drama. Wagons do not try the gorge. They pass beside it, learning again that the obvious spectacle is not always the right path. The gate plays a different part instead. It narrows the sky and sharpens attention. Even the talkers in camp lower their voices. Wind uses the stone to make music that could be hymn or warning. Your hand checks a rope for wear without thinking. Your eye counts spokes as if numbers could comfort. South Pass lies ahead, unassuming as a meadow, which is precisely why it matters. Everything before it has taught the false lesson that important thresholds look like walls. The pass refuses the performance. It offers a broad, gentle crossing at the spine of a continent, a place where wheels can keep their rhythm while your lungs notice thinner air. When the first fur traders learned its secret from older feet, they carried back a fact that changed more than maps. Wagons could go through the Rockies without being dragged or dismantled. The impossible was merely less dramatic than expected. That is history's habit. It hides its hinges in plain sight and saves its thunder for the people who did not pay attention. Stand there in the open light and mark what the past proves. The trail is a network laid first by animals and indigenous nations, then traced by traders, and only later widened by emigrant traffic. The United States did not invent the doorway. It found it, named it loudly, and used it thoroughly. Naming is not nothing. Names steer thousands, including families now counting flour and miles with equal care. Yet honesty requires the ledger to include earlier owners of this knowledge. That admission is not rebellion. It is repair. On the far side, grass changes character and wind learns new tricks. The shadows of clouds travel faster across this higher plane. People feel it in their legs and in their talk. Humour grows quieter, not because spirits have fallen, but because everything feels a degree more serious. The wagons have crossed a line that maps try to symbolise with a tidy divide. The ground refuses tidy. It shifts by handfuls, then acres, then a day's walk. What remains steady are the habits the first 100 days taught. Rise early. Spare the teams. Help a neighbour stuck axle deep in a bank that looked dry enough to trust. At camp, someone unfolds a letter copied by hand from a cousin who went ahead 2 years before. It lists what comes after the pass with the economy of a field report. Follow the Sweetwater until it turns stingy. Keep the snake always in mind once you find it. Fort Hall will be your hinge if supplies begin to whisper final. Do not be dazzled by cut-offs that promise speed and demand water you do not have. The voice of the letter carries less swagger than any speech made in a town square. It carries a cadence built from mistakes turned into guidance. Is it still the Oregon Trail if it keeps changing? A boy asks, eyes on the horizon. It is the Oregon Trail because we keep choosing the wiser line, his father says. That answer contains the myth's cure. The road is not ordained. It is selected again and again by people who care more about finishing than proving a point. Finishers write the place names on maps and in memory. Finishers found schools and mills and courts. Finishers also carry the responsibility for what their finishing costs neighbours who were already here. That second truth will not be left to the margins later. For this stretch, the focus stays on the geography of decision. From the pass, you can trace the logic that leads to Idaho. The Snake River Plain will take the column like a conveyor, if the column respects it. Heat bakes and dust insists on living in your mouth. River crossings reset the argument between patience and display. Fort Hall matters there because it is more than buildings. It is an idea that the road is a sequence of supported leaps, not a blind charge. Before you taste that truth, you still have miles of sage and stone to cross, keeping to low rises that let eyes search for hazard early. A wagon wheel sings a thin note when its hub dries. Someone hears it and smiles without mirth. Grease saves wood. Routine saves temper. This is the democracy of the trail, where a man's title from the east buys nothing that a bucket of axle grease does not buy faster. The company values calm far more than reputation. Calm is contagious. It makes children sleep in storm wind and keeps a driver's hands from turning reckless near a ford. The longer you walk, the more the landmarks become companions rather than marvels. Courthouse and jail lose their novelty and gain their serviceable role as mallkeepers. Chimney's Tease becomes a joke that hurts less now that you recognise the trick of clear air. Independence Rock's carved names look less like vanity and more like a conversation with the future. Devil's Gate forgets to scare you because you memorise the sensible route beside it. South Pass refuses to grow dramatic no matter how many times you thank it. Gratitude does not require spectacle. It requires recognition. In the evenings, the compass returns to its place under the lantern. It is still and modest, a needle willing to be ignored by men who have learned to judge by stars and grass. Yet it sits like a rebuttal to the old lie. If the trail were a single groove, no needle would be needed. If the road were a stripe, you could follow blind. No letters would matter, and no fort would rise where choice is knots. The compass is here because the trail is a climbing set of decisions, made by families who keep revising their path to match their strength. That revision will soon become explicit. A handful of roads will offer savings that carry their own costs. The short line west of here, praised by impatient men, demands a bargain with thirst. Another line bends north to a post where trade goods become lifelines and gossip becomes strategy. The Platte has kept your column honest by limiting conceit. The Snake will test a different virtue, asking if you can keep facts ahead of hope. You do not need to answer tonight. It is enough to bank the fire and listen to animals settle. Tomorrow the land will lift and tilt toward that testing ground. Fort Hall waits beyond a horizon that carries heat mirage like a banner. Choices wait with it, some worth the risk, some dressed in speed and hungry for fools. The compass will tap gently against the packing list when you pick it up. Remember what the sound means. The road west remains plural until you make it singular with your feet. By the time the trail drops from South Pass, rumour has learned manners. It no longer speaks as prophecy. It speaks as options with prices. The country ahead holds a straight line that promises speed and a safer line that promises water. Both are honest. Both take something from you. No signboard helps. only practice and the memory of other people's mistakes carried forward by letters and talk. The first option rides a bold name spoken with a whisper of pride. Men call it a cut-off because it shaves distance from weeks. The map shows it sliding across dry ground to rejoin the main road farther west. The flatter words hide the larger truth. The saving is measured in mile. The cost is measured in thirst. Springs thin to grit. Streams shrink by noon into memory. Those who choose it must carry more water than hope. Those who choose it and miscount learn how quickly a day's heat empties even careful barrels. The country there does not hate you. It simply wants payment in a coin you cannot mint. The safer line keeps faith with rivers that can still be found on hot afternoons. It bows toward bends where cottonwoods show green despite August. It asks for patience instead of bravado. Fort Hall becomes the hinge for both lines, a place where news and bacon and spare iron change hands. Everyone arrives there dusty and a shade more quiet than they intended to be in spring. A post like this makes speech useful again. Need replaces posture. Lists grow short and honest. Coffee, powder, axle grease, shoes for beasts, needles for people, thread for harness, a spare tongue for a wagon you swear you do not need until you do. Fort Hall is older than many of the wagons that rest beneath its shadow. It was built to feed a trade that ran on fur and talk long before wagons made the door wider. The buildings are not handsome, but they do not need to be. Strength matters more than style when snow and wind choose a night to test joinery. In the yard, eastbound travellers pass by with faces that look carved thinner by distance. They leave lessons behind that weigh nothing. Do not trust a cloud to shade you without also stealing your wind. Count every animal every evening, because coyotes count too. Tie down barrels, even when the ground looks smooth. The man who tells you he never had trouble has forgotten his trouble's name. At a table inside, a clerk copies letters for people who cannot write yet want to send news east. The words repeat the same bargain. We are well enough. The country is big enough. The water is sometimes kind. The teams hold out if you hold back your pride. A woman asks if there is a safer ford ahead. The clerk nods toward a messenger who has just come downriver. He speaks with a voice shaped by water's moods. Find the snake and keep it close, he says. Gentle and sure. It will guide you. It will test you. It will never be patient with fools. When the column pushes on, the landscape opens like a book printed with scant ink. Sage crowds the sentences. Heat edits what is left. The Snake River plain carries wind like a courier. Dust gathers behind each wheel and climbs into throats that already know its taste. The river itself flickers in and out of reach, sometimes close enough to hear, sometimes a rumour drawn thin by distance and mirage. When you meet it, it pretends to be lazy. That is its habit and its trap. Depth pulls in odd corners, current hides where brown water looks asleep. People learn to listen to the men who swim before they drive. Rope speaks sense when language fails. On days when sun dries everything except the river, decisions grow sharp. You could raft when banks rise and landing places pinch. You could ford when riffles show a pattern that even tired eyes can trust. Either choice requires order, and order begins with the circle each dawn. Teams are paired with drivers who will not panic when animals balk. Children are told where to stand and where not to stand. The woman who never raised her voice at home now commands silence by lifting a hand. That hand becomes law for 5 minutes and may save a life that afternoon. There are evenings when a fish jumps and a story rises with it. Someone remembers a cousin who chose the short line across dry ground and counted barrels with a thumb wet from his own mouth. He made it a little burnt at the edges and spoke for months as if he'd outwitted the sun. Another person remembers a pair who tried to float without knowledge and lost a wagon and a child to current that cared for no one. The lesson is not that one road is always better. The lesson is that bravado dies faster than caution in this kind of country. Other roads break away here like thoughts that will not leave. A portion of the train drifts south toward a valley that will one day harvest Sultan stories with equal force. Their reasons are sober and clear. They seek a place where belief can stand without being shoved. The main column watches them fade like smoke and feels the math change. Fewer mouths share the same sacks. Fewer hands share the same ropes. A day later, the trail splits again for people pulled by metal and rumour. They point toward a far country where new maps are already being drawn in fevered minds. Gold is a word that erases other words. It wipes out the advice of rivers. It laughs at patience. Still, the old rules hold. Distance cannot be bribed. Dust does not care for hope. For those who keep their eyes on the northwest, the road's character evolves without ceremony. Grass thins and then returns in different clothes. The land keeps speaking in its plain grammar. Follow water, rest animals. Do not chase another wagon's pace because you do not know how many of their barrels leak. Somewhere ahead, a mountain wall waits, painted blue by air and story. People have said its slopes are kind at dawn and cruel at afternoon, the way some men are, the way some years are. No one jokes about that because everyone knows that jokes spend more energy than they give back on long climbs. After weeks of clay and grit, the first trees that look like real shade feel like a treaty. They gather along draws where water hides in roots. Tools emerge from boxes because wood invites work. A spoke gets shaved and fitted. A handle gets replaced with a stubborn pride. The sound of iron against green wood feels human again after so much sky. Even fatigue changes tone beneath branches. Sleep becomes deeper and less twitching. A mother's face softens. A child's cough quiets, as damp-aired as the small kindness that medicine cannot reach yet. When the column begins to climb into that blue wall, silence spreads without being asked. Wordless labour takes hold. Men lean into wheels and do not pretend they are strong alone. Women drive teams with lines threaded through hands already scarred by chores that never appear in songs. The road up is not dramatic every hour. It is simply constant. That is its mercy and its trial. Constant steals stories from evenings because everyone goes to sleep mid-sentence. It gives them back later as memory made clean by rest and distance. Along high slopes, the world arranges its own markers. Fallen trunks cross the path like questions. Do you move them, or go around, or wait for another mind to see a third answer? The company's better talkers become quiet again because action sorts worth with more honesty than words. When a wheel slips, there is no speech that holds it. Only hands, wedges, and a mule's will refocus the day. The entire train becomes a simple machine for hours. Lift, brace, breathe, set. Lift, brace, breathe, set. Children learn to count work this way and forget to be bored. The first view down the western slope is not a painting. It is a list of tasks you have not met yet. Valleys pocket heat. Streams twist without warning. The sky repeats its wide promise each morning and keeps it for exactly as long as clouds permit. You become a person who measures gratitude in small coins. A good ford. A day with wind enough to clean sweat from sleeves. A night when wolves keep their distance and the teams lie without moonlight. These are not victories for history books. They are bricks that keep a house from bending. At lower elevations, water returns with a different accent. It speaks through a river that loves to brag. The wide channel scours banks and displays a talent for ignoring the needs of wagons. It invites rafts and then makes sport of them. People who sat a horse like they were born to it now learn the humility of waiting for a ferry that will not come until the man who runs it decides. The wind has learned manners. The names of rapids are not written on any official paper yet, but the faces of those who have met them carry the important parts of their grammar. A post stands near one bend, offering another chance to choose the better of two risks. A trader there has a way of sorting talk into useful piles. He will sell you flour without pretending it tastes like anything more than necessity. He will sell you news without pretending it tastes like anything less than risk. He speaks of a road that turns north and west through trees and skirts the anger of a river that refuses to be bridled. The road is new by the trail's old measure. People built it for people, with tools and saws and a belief that paying men to cut away is sometimes cheaper than paying water to be gentle. The road charges a toll. The river charges lives when pride misreads it. Either debt feels heavy when coin and hope both run low. Men and women squat beside a cook fire and draw lines in dust with sticks like generals who happen to be tired parents. The debate is not loud. Loud wastes air. The raft takes us faster, one says, knuckles chalked with ash. The road saves our children's sleep. Another answers, eyes on the slope where timber waits. No one laughs at either argument because both are true. There is a reason this place has a reputation. It is the country's way of asking if you have learned the rules it has been teaching since the first day. Favour water when it is friendly. Favour wood when water turns cruel. Do not pay for speed with what cannot be replaced. As the column rests there, a man who keeps a small box of papers in his wagon produces something folded and brown. He found it last year in a town store, saved it as if it were currency, and now treats it like a kind of promise. It is a ticket for the timber road, printed with a name that will matter here for years. He holds it like an amulet, strange to the touch and sure in its own way. The ticket admits that people can make a passable trail where nature forgot to offer one. It also admits that order costs, and that safety sometimes arrives with a price stamped in ink rather than blood. Children pass the paper between careful fingers and ask the best question. Does this buy us the easy way? One says, almost reverent. It buys us a chance to keep choosing right, the mother answers, folding the ticket once more. The company's talk turns to practical arithmetic. How many wagons can spare coin without starving? How many men can raft with skill enough to keep cargo and pride afloat? Who will go first in either case? And who will wait to see if the first verdict comes back smiling? No one envies the first verdict. Everyone depends on it. Evening leans into the camp with a different weight than the plains. Trees compress sound in a way grass never did. The river speaks on in its loud language. A lantern swings from a break and drips light, a small, steady argument against the hugeness around it. The compass from weeks back lies near a folded list. The needle holds true as it always has, but truth now includes something new. Direction alone does not finish this road, decisions do. They do again at this bend beneath this ridge where men have cut a road and the river refuses apology. The company will decide at first light, not to court drama, but to respect daylight. Some will choose the raft, trusting quiet water near the banks and the sure hands of those who have listened to this river longer. Some will choose the road, trusting wood and slope more than a surface that sometimes pretends sleep and then sits up speaking in white teeth. Neither choice is foolish. The foolishness would be to forget the trail's long lesson and pretend choices do not carry weight. The land never promised that. Not once. The last chores fold into night. Harness hangs where it will be easy to reach when dawn finally puts gold above the far ridge. Fires collapse into coals. Someone hums a thin song that came from a church 1,000 miles east, and the sound threads through wagon canvas without waking anyone. The paper ticket waits in a small box beside a handful of coins and a small braid of hair cut at a river months back. It smells faintly of resin and dust, like decisions always do. Morning will bring men who know the road with axes still bright from yesterday. Morning will bring men who know the river with poles that feel the bottom without seeing it. Morning will bring a vote shaped less by voices and more by the way eyes glance at children sleeping beneath quilts. The trail has been asking for courage in many forms since the first yoke creaked onto the first neck. Here it asks for a final, particular kind. Choose the danger you are prepared to meet. Choose it with respect. Choose it knowing that the country keeps score in simple units. Miles made, lives kept, promises kept. The wind off the water stirs the edge of the packing list and makes the compass click against wood. It sounds like a clock, but the trail has never followed clocks well. It follows light and weather and the shifting balance between strength and need. At first light, a man will open the small box and lift the folded ticket. He will hold it until others nod, or he will set it back without shame. Either motion will bend the line west in a way that maps will one day show and school children will trace. For now, only a few people know how much that bend costs and what it buys. First light finds every face turned the same direction. The paper ticket lies ready, its fold pressed flat by a palm that has measured distances all summer. Beside it, a poleman cleans grit from a ferrule with quiet care. Two endings wait here, neither simple, neither kind. The river offers speed paid in nerve. The timber road offers control paid in toil. The map never promised a single line. It only promised choices that cost. The people who choose water move first. Rafts come together from spare planks and borrowed nails. Barrels shift toward the centre, lashed until rope sings from strain. Wheels are lifted and tied high against the raft frame, because wheels belong to ground, not current. A man wades to mid-thigh to test pull and depth. He looks back, lifts 2 fingers, and lets the river take his hips another pace. Follow the slow edge, he calls, breath even, not brave. The boat noses out. The bank tilts. The world becomes motion and arithmetic. The snake's long lessons have not prepared anyone for this louder teacher. The Columbia wears broad water like a polite mask. It thins that mask without warning where stone narrows its throat. Pools collect drift. Eddies invite, then slap. A pole finds gravel, then nothing, then a snag that pretends to be mud. A boy crouches behind a barrel and prays without shaping words. A woman keeps her eyes on the bank and the man guiding the bow. She counts his steps like a metronome, slow and ruthless. Count 11, then push. Count 5, then wait. The river answers or refuses according to its own schedule. Rough days turn time elastic. Distance shrinks faster than labour should allow, then stretches across a single troublesome bend. Ferries appear like sanity returned to a hot forehead. Their keepers sell passage with fair, hard eyes. They have buried people here. No one argues prices with men whose boots speak that much river. Bales move aboard, livestock follow with trembling patience. A plank creaks, then holds because care multiplies strength in places like this. A child laughs once when spray kisses his cheek. The laugh sounds like a kind lie told to keep a house standing. Not every hazard on water is loud. Fog can slip between banks and make a practiced pilot squint like a beginner. Sun can angle off a slick and paint depth that does not exist. The river changes its mind in late afternoon, shouldering wind into chop that writes new grammar on the surface. Two men argue in gestures no one else understands, then agree on silence. Silence makes room for decisions to fit. When the raft noses ashore after a hard reach, the bank feels like justice underfoot. People speak quietly while unloading because their bodies are still tuned to current. Those who choose wood over water learn another language entirely. The Barlow Road begins under trees that seem to admire effort. Saw marks glint on fresh cuts where yesterday's hands made today possible. Men with axes widen narrow places without drama. They do this work for coin, for pride, for the belief that a safer way is a public good. The path rises and falls without flourish around a mountain that keeps its own weather. The name printed on the ticket becomes a kind of blessing when wheels meet first slope. The blessing does not erase gravity. It only promises a way to bargain with it. Animals lean and blow, leather strains, wedges knock like small gongs. Ropes snake from wagons to trunks. The command to walk comes in short, crisp words. No one wastes breath describing fear to people already carrying it. A driver counts paces and looks for rock that will hold a wheel. His partner sets a chock with a wrist that remembers how to spare fingers. Women walk beside barrels, hands ready to steady, eyes scanning for roots that jump at tired ankles. Children keep to the safe line because a look from their mother places them there more firmly than any stake. Timber helps and hinders in the same hour. Shade saves strength. Roots bully wheels. A tree falls cleanly when cut well, and turns into a bridge that refuses to flex. The road shows where yesterday's mud grabbed and let go. Tracks through it shine dull and deep. Men laugh once, not unkindly, at how a place can be both sturdy and fickle. It is work, not luck, someone says, wiping pitch from a palm. The work builds a rhythm that feels like muscle memory learned across years rather than days. Haul and halt, brace and breathe. Talk only when talk adds strength. A toll gate appears like a fact finely written down. The keeper counts wagons without judgment. He has heard every story and knows they sound the same after sundown. Coin passes hand to hand. The paper ticket unfurls and meets his nod. He tears a corner with a practiced pinch. The sound is small and ceremonial. It says that order costs because order protects. It says that safe is never free here, only earned and maintained. Behind the gate, the cut sections widen into a series of promises kept by people with tools and a plan. Storms trouble both endings in different ways. On the river, a west wind can push against current and turn calm water spiteful. On the road, rain turns a slope into soap and makes wagons skate despite wedges. Everyone learns to wait. Waiting is a skill that looks like nothing from a distance and everything from 3 feet. A camp forms under firs, fires burn low, voices stay level. 2 men argue whether to move before noon. An older woman ends the debate by holding up a child's damp blanket. Dry first, she says, and no one disagrees. When weather clears, both lines begin to converge, not on a single lane but on the same future. People meet again whose faces separated at the last bend. They compare new scars and old jokes. One man shows a nick on his forearm where a rope tried to teach him humility. Another offers a story of a log that became a bridge exactly when needed. The stories are true even when they are polished. Truth has room for polish if the facts sit square underneath. Ahead the mountain gives way to blue foothills and then to a valley that looks like relief after so much decision. The river unknots. The road straightens. A town waits where a smaller river meets a larger one and makes a promise that wheat and fruit can keep. The name will become famous in a few years, printed on crates and deeds. Today it is a cluster of roofs and a mill noise half hidden by trees. Oregon City speaks a practical dialect. Bring your claim, mark your line, plant before rain if you can, and after rain if you must. Arrival is not triumph, it is transition. You step down from a wagon that now creaks like an elder and feel land that no longer moves beneath your feet. The stillness is strange, almost loud. A clerk at a table asks for names and numbers, then adds those numbers to others already gathered here. A woman counts children with a hand that cannot stop counting. She will count them 100 more times before night, because habit fights fear more easily than celebration does. A boy stares at the mill wheel until someone hands him a small loaf and he remembers hunger. There is a market for everything practical. Seed and spade, nails and stove parts. This market exists because people turned a trail into a road and a road into a map and then pushed that map into lived life. A man trades a spare yoke for a shovel because the next work will be vertical instead of horizontal. A woman wraps a bolt of cloth because work must also dress cold mornings and stretch sleeves. People speak of lots and fences with a certainty that feels like rest after months of options. The compass that served all summer now sits in a drawer, its needle true, its duty paused. The paper ticket returns to the small box. It has paid for a passage that looks unremarkable when described and unforgettable when carried. It still smells of resin and hands. It joins a list of saved objects that mean more than their weight. A child's drawing of a chimney-shaped rock. A smooth pebble from a river that played at kindness and cruelty in the same hour. A broken spoon that stirred meals the day after someone fell sick and still stirred the day after they walked again. Objects like these hold roads inside them. The people who floated tell a different story at dusk. They talk about edges and eddies, about how patience and short bursts of strength made sense when speech did not. They talk about listening to men who knew a bend before they could see it. They do not brag. They simply describe, and description touches something quiet that everyone shares now. The people who climbed around a mountain tell of ropes that hummed and wedges that thudded, of mud that tried to keep what it could not own. They talk about seeing the valley open like a hand when the last stand of trees broke apart. The tradition that brought them west has changed its shape. It is no longer a line on a map asking for courage tomorrow. It is a street grid asking for boundary stones and patience. It is a ledger asking for dates and marks that will outlast handwriting. The biggest choice becomes smaller ones that still matter. Where to dig a well, where to cut a door, which neighbour to ask for help when a chimney leans. The pioneer story learns a homestead accent without losing the road's grammar. It retains the habit of waking early and measuring a day by tasks rather than clocks. There is a temptation to speak about endings here. The country will not permit it. The valley runs on cycles that do not care for human schedules. Rain comes when it has finished with the mountains. Illness travels along new lanes just as easily as wagons did along old ones. A cough in one cabin becomes a concern across 3. The water that looks so generous at noon looks different after dusk. When a lantern shows what dust and use can hide, people who walked 2,000 miles to reach a river town now learn to boil, to strain, to wait. Distance never was the only danger. Night settles over roofs that did not exist last spring. A church bell that travelled here in a wagon speaks a hopeful note. It rings over fences and high grass and the first line of stumps that promise fields next year. Children sleep the heavy sleep of people who no longer rock with the ground. Their dreams hold no wheels, only doors and trees and a dog that has finally stopped barking at wind. Somewhere a man lifts a cup of water and studies it against lamplight. He sets it down and adds another stick to the fire before he drinks. The old path keeps working behind everything. Even when boots no longer press it, it lives in habits that will sustain or betray. It shows up in how people share a bucket at a public pump. It shows up in how they dispose of waste when a cold rain keeps them inside. The trail was built by choices among routes. The town will be built by choices among risks that do not look like roads. We came to plant, a woman murmurs, watching steam lift from a pot. So we must keep what plants depend on clean. The sentence is plain and entire. It lands like a rule learned late but worth obeying. Morning will bring survey lines and hammer blows. It will bring paper deeds that convert hope into rectangles. It will bring the work of making a well safe after a flood, and a field safe after a herd wanders through. It will also bring a wagon from upriver with news of sickness along a long bend where too many camps emptied waste too near the same bank. The men at the mill will pause their talk of lumber sizes. The clerk will set down his pen. Someone who understands water will show people how to respect it in stillness the way they respected it in motion. A coin ticks once as the small box closes. The folded ticket settles against the compass and the pebble. Outside, the river continues its steady speech, no longer an obstacle, not yet a friend. Wind moves through cottonwoods with the same low voice it used on the plains. The difference now is what listeners bring to it. They have learned that roads branch and merge, and that the last branch is not the last lesson. Tomorrow's map will not show new lines, only new cautions. The tradition they have joined asks for care, not only courage. The day begins with a simple choice that is not simple at all. A hand hovers above a tin dipper, close enough to feel cool metal, far enough to hesitate. The barrel holds last night's river, lifted in haste as the stars came out. The surface looks calm, faintly brown at the edges, not yet talking. Beside the barrel sits a small glass vial, cloudy from travel, cork-stained by years. Beside that, an iron kettle waits with the patience of tools. The trail teaches this order. Look, decide, then heat. Camp moves inside this rhythm. A boy stacks chips and twigs, careful as if counting. A woman tips the dipper into the kettle, not the mouth. The kettle's side. She never lets the dipper kiss her lips now. A man feeds the coals, face turned from the first smoke. The doctor, not a doctor by papers, checks the vial. Then the children's eyes. He asks the same slow questions each morning. Any cramps? Any restless sleep? Any sharp thirst? He has learned to keep his voice even. Even voices travel farther than shouts out here. The kettle answers before anyone else. It trembles along the handle, then breaks into a steady sound. Boil first, then cool, then pour. This rule has no poetry, yet it holds lives the way a hand holds a railing. They learned it from a camp 3 days back, where a girl fell sick at noon and could not sit up by dusk. The water there ran friendly, wide and bright, then turned on them without warning. People speak of wolves and arrows in night stories. At noon, they speak of water and mean fear. Out on the flats, sickness moves faster than wagons. It rides in buckets and in haste. It hides in cups shared by cousins and neighbours, in hands that carry comfort and also risk. The worst of it takes a strong man and empties him within 12 hours. It does not argue. It does not bruise. It simply drains. They use the old word that travelled with ships and ports and markets. Cholera, they say, and the word shortens the day. Dysentery follows, less sudden, more stubborn. Measles runs through a camp like laughter, then keeps running. Smallpox returns like a story you thought had ended. Fever coughs from 1 bed to 3. Winter cold will later sharpen lungs and steal breath, but summer water already wages its quiet war. Here is the part the old tales forgot or chose to decorate. Most who die do not fall to bullets or painted faces. Most fade beside wheels and fires, a few yards from food and family. The score is kept by microbes no one can see, and by accidents that look like mistakes until you understand the work. A child runs at the wrong moment, a wheel lifts, then lowers, and the camp goes very still. A man shoulders a log across a current, misjudges, and the river takes him as if he was always meant to be a branch. A gun discharges during cleaning because fatigue travels into fingers. These are not stories anyone wants to tell, so they tell them plain. The train keeps walking because walking costs least. Oxen save strength when people spend theirs. The ground writes long sentences under the sun, and feet answer with short replies. You hear leather, wood, breath, the click of a buckle, the small notes of a pot lid settling. A woman carries a baby on one hip and a bundle of dry chips on the other. She scans the ground for prickly stems and clean fuel. Her eyes know 36 shades of dung and which of them burns best. A man tightens a trace and watches the wheel like a friend who sometimes bolts. He knows the lanolin smell of grease means one less sound later. At noon they seek shade that makes its own breeze. Food is the simplest math. Flour, bacon, coffee if luck held at the last post. Beans swell when water is hot. Children weigh their bites against an afternoon of steps. 2 men debate crossing a side stream now or at evening. The one who favours now has a cut on his wrist and wants cold to do what cloth cannot. The one who favours later points at clouds, thin and high, the kind that hide trouble. Between them stands the woman with the kettle. Boil, do you always boil, she says, and the men nod because that is the ground the argument needs. A cough begins 3 camps ahead of them, and news comes backward faster than carts. People learn to ask careful questions without sounding like a threat. Which bank did they draw from, above or below that bend? Where were the latrines? How far from the cooking pits? Did they wash hands? Did they share cups with visitors? No one likes these questions. Everyone asks them. Pride learns manners here because water does not care where pride came from. You measure distance in dippers and pots now. Not only miles. Early myths spoke about ambushes behind every hill. Hills mostly hide wind. Men with painted faces sometimes approach, more often to trade than to fight. A string of dried fish for an extra file. A pouch of roots for a bit of tobacco. Even a Baptist hymn hummed under breath. Suspicion sits near every exchange. But so does curiosity. Children stare at children because staring is a language you cannot outlaw. The old worry lives low in stomachs, fed by stories from back east. Yet days pass with greetings and gestures and no arrows arc. The worst hours fall inside the camp rope, not outside it. The bottle by the kettle holds a bitter tincture used when bowels will not rest. It is not a cure. It is a small hand on a racing heart. The man who carries it knows how little it can do. He also knows that doing little matters when you have nothing else to offer. He counts the sick with flint eyes. Not cruel, simply exact. He writes the counts on paper torn from a ledger, because numbers build rails across panic. Later, a reader will say his numbers belong in a book. Today they belong on a wagon tongue where everyone can find them. There are rules, not posted but lived. Do not dip where hooves have churned. Do not camp on ground that smells sweet and stale at once. Do not leave refuse near the bank, because current returns what you give. Do not hand a full cup to a child who's been playing in dust without first washing those hands again. Do not argue near the sick, because anger shortens air in rooms that already have too little. Men break these rules when tired. Women enforce them with looks that could stop a wheel. Children learn faster than either. Evenings are a quiet theatre where fear and hope change places every hour. A fiddle will sometimes start, a tune made thin by tired strings, and then someone coughs and the music rests. The kettle earns its keep over and over. Each boil another vote for tomorrow. Bread tastes of smoke and grit. Yet it returns salt to a body that needs salt badly. A young man stands apart, polishing a gun he barely used this month. He's cleaning an idea about himself more than a tool. An older woman sets a dipper upside down to dry and watches him without judgment. You will carry buckets someday, she says, tone kind and already certain. They pass landmarks that look like monuments, and sickness pays no attention. Chimney-shaped rock on the horizon, a courthouse of stone left by ancient water, a devil's gate where a river learned to carve its own throat. These names help mouths plan miles. They do not stop microbes from passing a camp where tired hands forgot a rule. The trail demolishes the glamour of sudden danger and replaces it with the arithmetic of daily care. This arithmetic is not inspiring when spoken. It is life when done. A wagon circle means less than some tales claimed, yet it has uses. It breaks wind and gathers people. It makes space for a doctor to pass from patient to pot without crossing animals. It holds light closer when a lantern swings at dusk. In that light, an infant's eyes can be read better. In that light, a woman can see whether lips are drying or staying soft. People learn to see bodies like weather and to predict storms from small shifts. The bravest thing many do is to sleep at all. The ground itself plays a role in who falls ill. Dust lifts and hangs and finds every throat. A mile of dust into a belly can sour even boiled water. So camps wet the road when they can, and when they cannot, they slow the line to let brown clouds settle. This decision irritates those who count miles like coins. It pleases those who count the living. A good leader learns to do both tallies, and to speak in a tone that allows dissent without losing time. There are days when nothing goes wrong and everyone is suspicious. Then there are days when trouble arrives in threes, evenly spaced. A wheel pin fractures at mid-morning and a child trips at noon. A woman feels the cramp that means more than grief by dusk. The bottle comes out, the kettle sings. The camp's older men stand ready to dig if needed, hoping not to. These men have learned the weight of a small grave on your back the next day. They have learned to look straight ahead and still see the corner of a blanket without tripping. Debunking the trail's grand myth does not cheapen courage. It clarifies where courage belongs. Heroes here carry dippers and ropes, not just rifles. They remember to wash even when the wind makes washing angry work. They walk beside a wagon 1 hour longer so an ox can live. They sit with a feverish boy and tell him about a city where the streets run downhill toward a wide river and boats shine like coins. They call that place by its proper name now, because naming helps hold the mind to a line. When rumours of violence reach them, the numbers still do not change. Some will be hurt by men. More will be taken by water and its companions. The truth is neither dramatic nor comforting, but it is steady. It allows planning to sit down and remove its hat. It permits grief to arrive in the afternoon and leave before supper. Not because grief is small, but because work refuses to abandon the living. A mother folds one shirt more than she needs to fold. A father tightens a strap that was already tight. Hope is work repeated until it looks like habit. Night finally lays its cool hand on the camp. Stars cut clean arcs. Someone miles away plays a tune that rides the dark without breaking it. The boy who stacked chips earlier now sleeps with one hand near the kettle as if guarding a crown. The woman dreams of a clean stream that never existed and wakes to make it real with fire. The man who counts keeps counting, adding up small victories. No one mentions miles until morning. Tonight they measure by breaths that return full, by hands that stop shaking, by stew that stays where it belongs. Near the embers, the small glass vial catches light and looks almost fine. It is not hope. It is a tool, like the dipper, like the kettle, like the rule that says boil again even when patience is thin. In the morning, feet will seek the same patient line west. The myth of constant battle can wait on a shelf at the last post, where someone carved initials into a plank and felt older. Out here, the worst enemy is as near as your bucket, as far as your discipline. The trail's truth sits steaming in a tin cup, too hot to swallow, necessary to live. A low cloud rests like smoke in the distance, but the sky clears by noon. The winds settle into a faint sigh, carrying dust from the next few miles. The oxen stand where they were left the night before, tethered but never idle. Each tether tightens at the same rate, pulling them forward without ever truly releasing them. The day promises nothing but more distance. Yet the promise of more carries its own weight, one that settles into bones after the first few hours of heavy work. Each step feels the same, and yet the landscape shifts in subtle ways. The soil changes to a darker, redder hue as they press forward into a new valley. The air feels warmer, but the constant clinking of iron and leather continues as though it's colder still. A woman pulls at the hem of her worn dress, adjusting the weight of a bundle. It's too familiar now, this feeling of weight, this pressure of a journey not fully understood but never questioned. There's something quiet about the day's heat. No birds call from the trees, and the rustle of leaves feels muted, almost absent. Only the sound of oxen breath and the shuffling of feet breaks the silence. The first few miles of this stretch are uneventful, a quiet sort of crossing that allows people to think, but not for long. Thoughts here are short, fragmented, and shaped by the rhythm of steps. The first sign of trouble appears just before noon. Cart creaks louder than usual. The man at the front of the train stops, raises his hand to the sky as though to take its measure, then waves it down and signals to a second wagon. The first ox has shifted in its harness, and the wheel looks misaligned. It isn't much at first, a slight pull, a minor obstruction in the natural flow of things, but it's enough to slow the entire line. There is no need for panic. There is no need for voices raised in warning. The others know it's only the beginning of something they've been trained to face. The woman in front, the one who has been carrying bundles all day, slows and looks at the group, silently assessing. Her hands are raw from earlier work, but she doesn't stop. She unfastens the small pouch at her waist and pulls out a small piece of twine. Knowing its use without thinking, the men know her too well to ask was wrong. She has a way of tying things that allows the smallest knot to pull through the toughest situations. The silence among them is not because they're unaware of the threat, but because they all know what is coming. A delay of minutes now will lead to hours. A snapped axle or a worn-out wheel could lose them the day, maybe two. This moment is small, but in the heavy air, it feels as though it swells. The line of wagons grinds to a halt in an effort to stay on course. A few hands reach for blankets, another to the last of the water. There is nothing but dry land stretching ahead, nothing to break the monotony of rocks and dirt. A quick, firm voice echoes down the line. We'll make camp early tonight. Get some rest while we can. The statement is followed by quiet acknowledgement. No one objects. They don't have the luxury of protest in this life. Not against conditions that simply are, but the weight of the statement hits them all at once. If they don't make it soon, they might lose another day, another moment. The difference between a good, solid meal tonight and a quiet, aching night under the stars could rest entirely on how quickly they can repair the damage. In another part of the camp, a child is already sitting under the half-cast shade of a tree. The pack rests beside them, light but heavy enough to show the strain. The child, not yet old enough to be burdened by the full weight of the journey, knows only the sweat that has dried to salt on their neck and the quiet that presses in from the sides. The camp continues to move with the same tired grace that they have carried for weeks now. They move as one an unspoken, fair, unbroken train of labour and will, grinding forward in an effort to make distance feel like something tangible, measurable. They take short breaks, but never stop. Stopping too long could mean forgetting what the next step feels like. The moment when the wheels stop turning is when everything can unravel. The steady, rhythmic creaking of wagon wheels continues to fill the air, punctuated by the steady breath of oxen. The day stretches ahead, unbroken, full of miles that feel like an endless sea of dirt and dust. As evening approaches, the camp settles into its ritual of familiar movements. The woman who helped tie the wagon begins to collect firewood, the sound of crackling branches breaking the silence for a moment. She knows better than to look behind her too often. It's the pulling weight, the endless forward movement that drives this whole effort. It's not about reaching the end, it's about each successive step, each shift of weight from tired limbs, each drop of sweat that eventually falls to the ground, absorbed by the earth they continue to tread upon. This is where they are in the quiet, relentless push forward. The air changes as night falls. The temperature drops sharply, the thin light of dusk folding into the folds of the mountains ahead. It will be cold soon, colder than they anticipate. A chill that bites the skin. That doesn't give easily. Even the firewood doesn't seem to burn as warmly as it should. But they continue. Even when the stars begin to prick at the darkening sky, they remain in their tasks. Meals are served, but there is no joy in them. The day is too long for anything but relief, and relief does not taste like supper. It tastes like knowing they have survived another hour, another moment, a breath that has not yet been stolen by hunger or thirst, by the thin stretch of their own resistance. A few voices rise over the crackling of the fire, their conversation carried by the wind, but soft, subdued. They talk about home, about what they left behind, about the vastness of what lies ahead. Their voices are steady, worn down by time, but still holding a touch of warmth. Yet, in their words, there is an acknowledgement of what is missing. The comfort of a home feels distant, as though it is a place forgotten, existing only in memories that are slowly becoming harder to recall. The wagon wheels creak again, and then they settle into place. No one speaks more than needed. The night stretches on like a quiet thought, a breath held until the morning calls them forward once again. The trail ahead will not change, but tomorrow will feel different. The weight of today will carry them through the night and into the next. The last flicker of firelight disappears as someone places the cover back over the flames, and the dark presses in closer, the stars still far enough away to remind them of how small they are in this world, yet how large their courage must be to keep going. Tomorrow will come, they will step into it without looking back, without stopping to ask why. There is no time to ask why when the next step is all that matters. The fire burns low, and the quiet between them deepens, wrapping itself like the night around the camp. The low murmur of the wind is almost soothing as it curls through the cracked branches of the trees, a reminder that nature is as unyielding as it is vast. The stars are sharp against the black sky, distant yet close enough to seem within reach, though no one dares reach for them. The distance is too great. They have learned that well by now. The woman stirs the embers, her hand steady but her thoughts far away. She's learned to keep her hands busy, her mind on the work. The weight of it, all the endless miles, the hard ground beneath them, the ever-present hunger is more than any one body can hold. But the mind must stay sharp, must stay clear, because there is no room for distraction, not with the trail ahead. As the night settles, the weight of the day begins to feel heavier in the stillness, as though the earth itself is holding them in place. The faint whispers of voices from the fire's edge carry, but there's no urgency in their tone, just words for words' sake. They talk about nothing and everything all at once, what they remember, what they've lost, and what they hope for. But hope is a delicate thing here, fragile and far off. It feels too far away to believe in fully. Tomorrow will come as it always does. The cycle of days is as certain as the motion of their wagon wheels, turning without pause, unrelenting. Tomorrow they will rise, stretch stiff limbs, and step into the day like it is a simple thing. But there is nothing simple about it. Nothing simple about the pull of each step, each mile, and the ever-present strain of the road beneath them. A quiet cough breaks through the stillness, a reminder that the night is not truly peaceful. There are the sounds of the night oxen shifting, hooves scraping the ground, small noises that are familiar, yet unsettling in their constant repetition. Every noise feels like an echo of something long lost. Every breath, every step feels like an attempt to outrun something that cannot be outrun. It is a restlessness that moves through the camp like a slow tide. The woman looks out at the horizon, the dark silhouette of the mountains pressing against the night. She's seen this view every day for months now, but each time it feels different. Each time, it feels more like a wall than a path. The wilderness ahead is vast, untamed, and full of unknowns. It's a reminder of the distance they've travelled, but it also mocks them. It seems endless. And in a way, it is. But they continue. They move forward not because they want to, but because there is no other option. The wagons creak, the wheels groan, and the oxen breathe heavily, each of them pulling together, steady and strong. It's the only rhythm they know. It's the rhythm that has carried them through every trial and will continue to carry them until they reach Oregon, or until they can go no further. It is not a question of why. It is simply what must be done. The fire burns low now, the last embers flickering in the soft breeze. The woman stands up, her back aching from the long hours spent bent over. But there is no time for rest. There is never enough time for rest. She straightens, eyes scanning the horizon once more. Somewhere out there, beyond the dark mountains, is their future. It seems as distant and unreachable as the stars overhead, but it is the only thing that pulls them forward. One by one, the others drift into a restless sleep, the quiet of the night wrapping itself around them like a heavy blanket. Their dreams are filled with the same things: the road ahead, the uncertainty of the land, and the heavy burden of their journey. There is no rest, no relief. Not yet. Not until they reach Oregon. The woman sits back down by the fire, the weight of the night pressing in on her. The fire is nearly out now, only the last few sparks still visible, the faintest trace of heat. She watches them die, slowly fading into the night, the last embers flickering in the silence. It is a quiet ending, but one that feels significant in its own way. It is a reminder that even the brightest flames eventually fade away, and so they wait, as they always do, for the morning to come, for the next day's journey to begin. The trail ahead remains as it always has, long, unyielding, and full of uncertainty, but it is their only path, and so they continue. With each passing hour, they step closer to the unknown, each one of them bound by the same quiet determination. The last of the fire burns down, and the night stretches on dark and still as the camp slowly drifts into sleep, the promise of tomorrow hanging in the air like the last breath of the day. The cold winds cut through the air as the wagons slowly trudged through, the barren landscape. For the pioneers, the journey westward on the Oregon Trail was far from the grand adventure they had imagined. What began as an exciting leap into the unknown had now become a fight for survival. The trail had taken its toll on them physically, mentally, and emotionally. Their journey had already taken them through deserts and rivers, but the Rocky Mountains were now ahead of them, a daunting wall of jagged peaks that seemed to rise endlessly into the sky. Each crevasse, each rocky outcrop seemed to mock the very idea of a safe passage. Yet, the pioneers pressed on, driven by the hope of fertile lands and the promise of a new life in Oregon. It was in this moment, as the travellers climbed higher into the mountains, that the full weight of their struggle became apparent. Families huddled together under the flimsy coverings of their wagons, the cold gnawing at their bones. Children cried in the back of the carts, their faces streaked with the dirt of the trail and the dust of exhaustion. The oxen, their once proud beasts of burden, now plodded sluggishly along, their strength drained by the unrelenting pace. Among the weary travellers was a man named Samuel, a farmer from Missouri, who had once dreamed of cultivating the vast, fertile plains of Oregon. He had set out with high hopes, but as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, his optimism had faded. He had lost his wife to an illness not long after crossing the Missouri River, and now his children were falling ill as well. The weight of the journey bore down on him, yet he pushed forward, his thoughts only on the promise of the land ahead. "We can't stop now," Samuel muttered to himself, his eyes scanning the rocky horizon. "We're so close. We have to make it." But as he looked at his children shivering in the back of the wagon, the doubt crept into his mind. Could they really make it? The mountains loomed before them like an unyielding wall, and the very earth beneath them seemed to rebel against their passage. Their route through the Rockies would be the most treacherous part of the entire journey. The once hopeful travellers now feared the crossing. The men had toiled for hours to prepare the wagons, knowing that the slightest mistake could cost them everything. The terrain was unforgiving, and every bend in the trail seemed to present a new challenge. But worse still were the rumours of Native American attacks, fueled by the settlers' fears and frustrations. The pioneers' fear of conflict with the indigenous tribes was not without reason. Tensions had been rising in the West for years, while many Native Americans had helped the travellers along the way, providing guidance and supplies. The arrival of so many settlers had begun to erode the delicate balance. Some tribes saw the settlers as invaders, taking what was rightfully theirs, while the settlers saw the tribes as obstacles standing between them and the promised land. "We can't trust them," one of the pioneers said, his voice tense as he looked over at a group of Native Americans by the side of the trail. "They'll take everything we've worked for." But others in the group were not so quick to judge. They had seen the kindness of the native people, and they didn't want to believe that all of them were hostile. However, as the days wore on and the pioneers' frustrations grew, it became harder to distinguish between fact and fear. Tensions were on the rise, and with it, the possibility of violence seemed inevitable. Through the heavy snow and biting winds, they reached the infamous South Pass, a key crossing through the Rockies. It was a momentous point in the journey, marking the halfway point between the beginning of the trail in Missouri and the promised land of Oregon. The pass was narrow and steep, a precarious passageway through the mountains. The wagons groaned under the weight of the supplies, the oxen straining to carry their loads, but as they crossed, there was a sense of achievement, a flicker of hope that they were on the brink of something greater. Yet, for Samuel and the others, the crossing was bittersweet. As they descended from the mountains, their thoughts turned toward the land ahead. Would it be all that they had been promised, or would the hardships they had faced on the trail continue to haunt them? No matter where they settled, the pioneers pressed forward, their hopes and dreams pushing them toward Oregon. But the road ahead was still uncertain. The rugged landscape, the sickness, the death, and the possibility of conflict with the Native Americans loomed large in their minds. Even as they moved forward, there was no guarantee of success. But for Samuel and the others, there was no turning back. They had come too far to stop now. The journey, though painful, had forged a bond among the pioneers, a shared sense of purpose that kept them moving forward, step by step. And though they had lost much along the way, they still had something left hope. As they continued on, they couldn't help but wonder if the promise of Oregon was worth the suffering, the loss, and the uncertainty. Would they find peace and prosperity in the land they had dreamed of? Or had they traded one struggle for another, one that would follow them even into the fertile lands they sought? The tension in the air was palpable, but there was no turning back. The pioneers pressed onward, driven by the promise of a new life, a new beginning. They had made it this far, and they were determined to see it through to the end. As the travellers continued through the rugged terrain, the true cost of the journey began to reveal itself in ways they hadn't fully anticipated. The wagons, now worn down by miles of grinding passage over dust and rocky paths, seemed to be an extension of their own exhaustion. The oxen, once strong and eager, now trudged with heavy steps, their ribs more pronounced as their bodies struggled to keep pace with the relentless pull of the wheels. The air had grown colder, and the mountain peaks on the horizon no longer offered a sense of majesty, but an intimidating promise of the difficult trials to come. It was not just the physical challenges that drained them, it was the silence that accompanied the long stretches of barren landscape. The vastness of the wilderness seemed to swallow them whole. Every mile forward felt like another step into an unknown abyss. Yet, it wasn't just the unforgiving terrain that they had to contend with. Disease had begun to make its presence felt within the ranks. The plague of sickness that had haunted earlier travellers on the Oregon Trail was beginning to strike with deadly force. Cholera, the most feared of all the diseases, was claiming lives faster than anyone could prepare for. It spread like wildfire, transmitted through the contaminated water that was the lifeblood of the pioneers' journey. In some cases, whole families were struck down in a matter of days, their bodies too frail to withstand the insidious disease. The smell of death had begun to permeate the air, an ever-present reminder of how fragile their existence had become. No one spoke of it, but it was understood the cost of the journey had already been too high. How many more would fall victim to the same fate before they reached the end of their journey? It was a question that plagued everyone but remained unspoken. Among the group, there was a woman named Sarah, who had joined the migration with her husband and 2 young children. She had been raised on stories of adventure, of new beginnings in the fertile lands of Oregon. But now, as she looked around at the weathered faces of the pioneers and the skeletal remains of oxen, those stories felt distant and hollow. The reality of the trail had shattered her naive dreams. The children, once full of joy and energy, had become shadows of their former selves, their spirits crushed by the hardship of the journey. "Mama, when will we be there?" her son asked one evening, his voice weak from days of fatigue and hunger. Sarah held him close, brushing the dirt from his face, her heart aching as she whispered a comforting lie. "Soon, sweetheart, soon. Just a little longer." But deep down, Sarah knew that their journey was far from over. The route to Oregon had become an ever-elongating stretch of empty hope. They had crossed rivers, braved storms, and fought off the gnawing fear of attacks from hostile native tribes, but the mountains still loomed, and the disease still lingered, just as deadly as ever. As they neared the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, the air grew thinner, and the temperature dropped even further. The pioneers were facing one of the most dangerous segments of the entire trail. It was here, at the foot of the mountains, that the true battle for survival began. The harshness of the environment, coupled with the already depleted resources of the travelers, set the stage for a struggle unlike anything they had faced before. "We're going to have to push through," one of the leaders, a man named Thomas, announced as he addressed the weary group. His face was grim, his eyes hollow from weeks of sleepless nights. The men gathered around him nodded, their faces showing signs of defeat but also a shared determination. They had no choice. The only way out was forward, and as they began the ascent toward the South Pass Narrow, treacherous gap in the mountains that had become a lifeline for many, there was a palpable sense of both dread and determination. The South Pass had been discovered years earlier, but now it felt like an insurmountable obstacle. The wagons groaned and creaked as they struggled to climb, and the oxen, worn to the bone, moved slower and slower, their breath coming out in short, laboured gasps. But even as they struggled to push forward, there was a flicker of hope among the travellers. They knew that if they could make it through the South Pass, they would be closer to their destination. The land that had been promised to them, land of fertile soil, abundant resources, and new beginnings, was just beyond the mountains. But that hope was fragile, a mere thread hanging between them and the harsh reality of the trail. As they crept forward, the tension grew. The air was thinner here, and with each step it became harder to breathe. Families pulled together, the men working to secure the wagons while the women and children tried to keep up. The nights were long and cold, the firewood scarce, and the food rations running dangerously low. Every small victory, every mile gained was met with an overwhelming sense of relief, but also dread, for the next obstacle was always just around the corner. And then, just when they thought they had made it through the worst of the pass, disaster struck. One of the wagons, overloaded with supplies, slipped off the narrow trail, tumbling down the side of the mountain. The crash was deafening, and for a moment, all was silent. The travellers rushed to the site, their hearts pounding in their chests, only to find that the wagon had broken apart, its contents scattered across the jagged rocks below. The sense of devastation that followed was unlike anything they had experienced so far. The wagon was not just a vehicle, it was a lifeline, carrying the few remaining provisions and tools that could see them through to Oregon. Without it, they would be forced to continue with even less than they had before. For many, this setback was a crushing blow to their already fragile spirits. As they stood there, looking down at the wreckage, the realization set in. The journey was not just a physical battle against the land, it was a mental and emotional struggle against their own limits. How much longer could they endure, but still, they pressed on. It was all they could do. As the pioneers ventured further into the heart of the Oregon Territory, the final stretch of their journey seemed both a relief and a terrifying unknown. The landscape that had once seemed full of promise now felt like an inescapable maze, its treacherous paths and unpredictable terrain a constant reminder of how far they had come, and how much further they still had to go. By the time they reached the final leg of their journey, the Oregon Trail had transformed from a symbol of hope into a grueling test of endurance. Families had been separated by illness, fatigue, and death. leaving behind not only loved ones but the very ideals of adventure and new beginnings that had once motivated their migration. What remained was a community of survivors, bound together not by dreams of a better life, but by the harsh realities of survival. The mountains that had once seemed distant were now looming giants, their snow-covered peaks mocking the travellers' exhaustion. The wagons creaked as they ascended the last unforgiving climb of the journey, the South Pass. It was here, at this narrow pass, that the pioneers had hoped for a breakthrough, a sign that their long ordeal was nearing its end. But the weather had no mercy. As they pressed on, the temperature plummeted and the once dry trail turned into a slippery, treacherous expanse of mud and snow. With every mile, it felt as though the land itself was fighting back, unwilling to let them pass without exacting a final toll. And then, just as the light began to fade on another exhausting day, disaster struck. One of the wagons, laden with the last of their meagre supplies, tipped over at the edge of a steep incline. It was a moment of chaos, screaming, shouting, the sound of oxen panicking, the crack of wood splintering under the weight of the earth itself. The wreckage was devastating, and for the families who had already lost so much, it was a crushing blow. The realization that they were now down to their final provisions set in like a cold wave. They had no choice but to continue, no matter how impossible the path ahead seemed. There was no turning back. The trail had already claimed so much from them: lives, hopes, dreams, but it still had more to take. And so, they pressed forward. The nights had grown longer and colder, the air filled with a biting wind that seemed to freeze the very marrow in their bones. Yet, despite the exhaustion, the travellers found themselves bound by an unspoken understanding they had to keep moving, or they would be lost. Lost in the snow, lost to the wilderness, or lost to the sickness that had already claimed so many of their companions. One evening, as the fire crackled weakly against the cold, a man named Peter, who had been travelling with his wife and 2 children, sat quietly by the dying embers. He had lost his younger brother to cholera earlier in the journey, and now his wife lay ill in one of the wagons, her fever rising with each passing hour. His heart ached as he watched his children huddled together under a single blanket, their faces drawn with hunger and fatigue. How much longer? His son asked softly, his voice thin and strained. Peter looked into the boy's eyes, the desperation in them mirroring his own. Not much longer, Peter replied, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. Just a little longer, and we'll be there. He could hear the hope in his own voice, but it felt fragile, like a thread stretched too thin. They had come so far, but there was still so much more to endure. The mountains ahead seemed as insurmountable as the trials they had already faced. Papa, are we going to make it? His son's voice was barely above a whisper. Peter didn't know how to answer. The truth was that he didn't know. The trail had already taken so much from them, and they were not yet at the end. He looked at the fire, watching the embers dance and flicker in the dark, and for a moment it seemed as though the world itself was holding its breath. The next day, they reached the last stretch of the South Pass, and the sense of finality grew stronger with every step. They were nearing Oregon, but the toll of the journey was visible in every face-hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, clothes tattered and worn from months of travel. There was no joy, no sense of victory, only the quiet understanding that they had made it this far, and that, somehow, they would have to keep going. But as they approached the final leg of their journey, the land began to change. The dry, barren hills gave way to fertile valleys, the promise of lush farmland, and the distant shadow of the mountains that had been both a barrier and a guide. It was here that they found a glimmer of hope, the land that they had been told would be their salvation. The moment was almost surreal. They had travelled for months, faced illness, loss, and hardship, and yet here they were, on the brink of reaching their destination. And yet, even as they stood on the threshold of their new lives, the reality of their sacrifices lingered like a weight in the air. "Is this it?" one of the travellers asked, her voice trembling as she gazed out over the landscape. It was a simple question, but one that carried the weight of everything they had been through. "Is this what we came for?" It was a question that had no easy answer, for the land before them was both a promise and a burden. They had come here seeking a new life, but it had cost them more than they had ever imagined. And as the travellers moved forward into Oregon, the final chapter of their journey, they knew that the true toll of the Oregon Trail was not just the hardships of the land, but the scars it left on their hearts. In the distance, The rolling hills of Oregon lay before them, a place they had longed for, a place that represented hope. But as the weary travellers crossed the final frontier of their journey, they knew that the sacrifices made along the way would never truly be forgotten. The Oregon Trail had tested them, shaped them, and left its indelible mark on their souls, reminding them that some journeys though seemingly ended live on in memory and legacy. As they moved on, they would build new lives, but their stories would live on, carried by the trails they had left behind and the land they had claimed. The legacy of the Oregon Trail would forever remain etched in the American spirit, a testament to resilience, perseverance, and the cost of claiming the West. The struggles faced by the pioneers did not end with their arrival in Oregon. In fact, their legacy would be intertwined with the fate of the indigenous populations who had lived on the land for centuries. But that, as the pioneers would soon discover, was another battle in itself. A solitary wagon wheel rests in the dust of the Oregon Trail, its once bright paint now faded by time. The marks it left on the earth are barely visible anymore, washed away by the winds that have blown across the plains for over a century. The Oregon Trail was never meant to be a symbol of success or glory. It was born from necessity, driven by forces of survival and an unwavering belief that the West was the future of the American dream. Yet, in the end, it was a path soaked in sacrifice, marked by the stories of those who risk everything in the pursuit of land, prosperity, and the promise of a new life. And while it was the birthplace of the American frontier myth, the true story of the Oregon Trail is one of hardship, tragedy, and the endless pursuit of something better. It began not as a trail at all, but as a network of ancient paths that had been used for centuries by indigenous tribes and animals. Long before the first settlers arrived, these trails had served the native people well, providing them with access to resources and linking the diverse landscapes of the western United States. For those who followed, these paths were a way forward, a means of survival in the wilderness. When fur traders and explorers from Europe and America arrived, they simply followed the well-worn tracks, unaware that they were walking in the footsteps of the peoples who had lived there long before. The first pioneers, those fur trappers, were not interested in settling the land. Their purpose was far more fleeting. They sought only to profit from the bountiful wildlife. The hunt for beaver pelts was a lucrative industry that connected the fur trade of the West to the booming fashion industries of Europe. These early trappers, however, were merely the first of many who would follow their path to Oregon. They saw the West as a frontier, a place to make a fortune, and eventually others would come seeking more than pelts. They would come to claim land, to build families, and to write their names into the history books. The turning point came in 1812 when Robert Stewart, a fur trader with the Pacific Fur Company, found the South Pass. This key discovery would prove essential in the creation of the Oregon Trail, for it was the first viable route through the Rocky Mountains that could be crossed by wagon. The pass was a natural gap in the mountain range, offering an easier route for wagons to navigate. For the first time, the dream of settling the West by land seemed possible, and with that discovery, the Oregon Trail was born. By the 1830s, the Oregon Territory, once a remote and isolated wilderness, had become a land of promise. Word spread eastward, enticing thousands of settlers with promises of fertile soil, free land, and the chance to start anew. The government played a pivotal role in this migration. The passage of the Donation Land Act of 1850 offered 320 acres of land to any single man who would settle in Oregon, and 640 acres for a married couple. This act was a game-changer, creating a rush of settlers eager to stake their claim in the fertile lands of the West. The pull to the West was also driven by a profound belief in manifest destiny, the idea that the United States was destined by God to expand across the continent. This belief was not simply an abstract ideal, but a driving force that permeated the political and cultural landscape of the time. It gave settlers the conviction that they were part of a divine mission, and with this conviction, they ventured westward, ready to tame the wilderness and bring civilization to the wild lands. To many, it was their duty to spread the values of democracy, progress, and the American way of life. But this expansion came at a cost. The indigenous peoples of the land had lived on the Pacific coast for thousands of years, and their way of life was about to be irrevocably altered. In addition to the political and ideological forces at play, economic hardships in the East provided further incentive for migration. The Panic of 1837 and the following Depression led many families to seek out new opportunities. Farming was no longer a stable livelihood in the East, and many saw Oregon as their last hope for survival. There, they could own land, start anew, and escape the crushing weight of debt. The Oregon Trail became a lifeline to those desperate to escape their circumstances. But the trail was not just a one-way path toward opportunity. It was also a journey of struggle and survival. The realities of life on the Oregon Trail were far more dangerous than many had imagined. The long journey, nearly 2,000 miles, took months, and the travellers faced challenges at every turn. The trail crossed through harsh and unforgiving terrain, where the weather could turn deadly, and where disease and hunger claimed many lives. The idea of free land came at a high price, and for many, that price was their life. The role of missionaries and religious groups in the Oregon Trail migration cannot be understated. Missionaries like Marcus Whitman played an important role in both guiding settlers and attempting to convert the native populations to Christianity. These missionaries were some of the earliest to travel the trail, and their letters home helped spread the word of the fertile land in the west. The letters they sent eastward detailed the opportunities that awaited pioneers, and were instrumental in convincing more and more families to make the trek. Yet, these efforts were not without their complications. Many of the missionaries faced violence, and their interactions with the indigenous tribes often created tensions that would flare up later. The sheer number of people making the journey was staggering. From 1843 to 1869, nearly 400,000 pioneers travelled the Oregon Trail, braving dangerous weather, crossing treacherous rivers, and surviving the perils of disease and starvation. The challenges were many, but the promise of land and the belief in manifest destiny drove people forward. For those making the journey, the hardships were not just physical, the emotional toll was great. Families were torn apart, and many never made it to Oregon. The death toll along the trail was staggering, with an estimated 20,000 to 30,000 people dying during the migration. The most common cause of death was disease, especially cholera, which spread quickly through the crowded wagon trains. Accidents were also common, with many people being killed by the wagons or drowning while crossing rivers. The journey was brutal, but for those who survived, it marked the beginning of a new life. The wheel of the wagon rests once more, silently marking the end of another leg of the journey. But the promise of Oregon still calls. The trail has already cost so much lives, hopes, and the very land that was fought for. And yet, for those who remain, the end is still not in sight. The true test of their resolve has yet to come. The journey along the Oregon Trail continued relentlessly, and the very land beneath the settlers' feet began to feel like both a promise and a curse. The feeling of adventure that accompanied the first few miles quickly faded as the relentless rhythm of the trail wore down the spirits of many. What once seemed like a beacon of hope now appeared as a series of endless, oppressive challenges. The dream of fertile land was tempered by the reality of hardship, death, and the stark isolation of the wilderness. Those who had started the trek with optimism now faced the overwhelming weight of survival. One of the most immediate challenges for the pioneers was the unforgiving terrain. The vast plains stretched on for miles, offering little in the way of shelter or relief. The scorching heat of summer quickly gave way to the frigid nights, and the ground, which appeared so promising at the start, often turned into treacherous paths of mud and dust. The constant struggle against nature's elements wore down both the bodies and minds of those who dared to make the trek. The tall grasses of the plains could provide no respite, offering no refuge from the sweltering sun. Then came the rivers. The rivers that had promised life-giving water quickly became one of the most feared elements of the journey. As the pioneers moved westward, they encountered numerous rivers and streams that needed to be crossed. The larger rivers, like the Platte, the Snake, and the Columbia, presented the greatest danger. Crossing them was no easy task. The current was swift, the waters cold, and the riverbeds often unknown. Many families would lose everything, as wagons and supplies were swept away, leaving settlers stranded in the wilderness. One of the most notorious river crossings was the Platte River, which posed its own set of dangers. The vast river basin stretched out in every direction, its banks sometimes unpredictable and full of hidden pitfalls. The river was not just a physical obstacle, it also tested the emotional and mental resolve of the travellers. As they made their way through the wilderness, facing the hot sun by day and the cold by night, their determination began to fray. Some families would lose their loved ones to sickness or the dangers of the crossing, while others would simply disappear into the vastness of the land. "Just cross the river. It's the only way," a voice would call. Each time the riverbank came into view, urging the wagon trains forward, the sound of rushing water was always close, its relentless flow echoing in the minds of the travellers. But even as the river threatened to sweep them away, it was still the only path forward. For every wagon that crossed safely, there were those that were overturned, their supplies lost to the depths. One of the hardest things for the pioneers was knowing that, for all the trials they had already endured, they were not even halfway through their journey, and yet they pressed on. As the settlers moved westward, they also faced the challenge of disease, a silent killer that could strike at any time. The most deadly of these was cholera, which spread rapidly among the travellers. The disease, carried in the waters they drank and the food they ate, would kill quickly, leaving whole families devastated. It was estimated that as many as 30,000 pioneers would die on the trail, with cholera being the leading cause of death. It was a disease that had no mercy, striking without warning, leaving those affected in agony. The epidemic spread with such ferocity that entire wagon trains would be decimated by it. Despite efforts to quarantine the sick and disinfect water supplies, cholera was an unstoppable force. Cholera was the only disease that plagued the settlers. Typhoid, dysentery, and smallpox also took their toll, as the poor sanitation of the wagon trains created fertile ground for the spread of illness. For every family that made it through a river crossing, there were families that would lose loved ones to the invisible enemy of disease. The sickness was a constant shadow over the travellers. Its presence a reminder that survival on the Oregon Trail was never guaranteed, and yet it wasn't just nature and disease that made the journey so perilous, it was also the human element. The relationships between the settlers and the Native American tribes they encountered were complex. While early interactions were often peaceful, as the number of settlers increased, so did the tension between the two groups. The native tribes had lived in the region for centuries, their lives intertwined with the land. The settlers, on the other hand, were intruding on that land, often in search of more resources, more space, and more wealth. Tensions began to rise, and the earlier peaceful exchanges gave way to conflict. As settlers encroached further on native lands, native tribes began to resist, and small skirmishes broke out. It wasn't long before these tensions boiled over, and violence began to erupt. The Kay's War of 1847 was one of the most significant examples of this conflict, sparked by the killing of the Whitman missionaries, Marcus and Narcissa Whitman. The settlers, who had relied on the missionaries for guidance, were suddenly thrust into a war with the very people they had once traded with. The violence was sudden, unexpected, and brutal. But not all conflicts were violent. Many native tribes, understanding the dynamics at play, chose to help the settlers in their journey, providing food, directions, and assistance in navigating the land. The Nez Perce and the Shoshone were among the tribes that helped the settlers along the trail, offering guidance and shelter when needed. But even these tribes could only do so much. As the number of settlers increased, the pressure on the land became unsustainable, and the natives' way of life began to collapse under the weight of this new wave of migration. As the settlers pressed on, they began to notice that the landscape was changing. The fertile plains were giving way to mountains, valleys, and forests. The Rocky Mountains loomed ahead, a massive barrier that had to be crossed before the settlers could reach Oregon. The South Pass, discovered by Robert Stewart in 1812, was the most accessible crossing point through the Rockies. But even here, the terrain was treacherous. The pass was high elevated at 7,412 feet and the air thin. The trail was full of sharp rocks, steep slopes, and unpredictable weather. But despite these formidable obstacles, the settlers pushed on. It wasn't just the promise of fertile land that kept them moving forward, it was the belief that the challenges they faced would lead them to a better life. The settlers knew that Oregon was the land of opportunity, a land where they could build new homes, create farms, and live the life they had always dreamed of. The hardships of the trail, from disease to danger, were just part of the price of that dream. But they believed that once they made it, they would have a new beginning. And so they marched forward, one step at a time, never stopping, never turning back. The hardships they endured would shape them forever, but the hope of Oregon still beckoned. As they crossed the river, navigated the mountains, and fought off the sickness that threatened to take them, the settlers never lost sight of what lay ahead. They knew that despite all they had lost, Oregon was worth it. The trail may have been filled with hardship, but it was also a journey that would change the course of American history. As the settlers reached the foot of the Blue Mountains in eastern Oregon, the promise of fertile land drew nearer. The finish line was within sight, but the end was not yet at hand. With the worst behind them, they could see the lush valleys waiting for them. Yet their hardest challenges were not yet over. The journey along the Oregon Trail continued, inching closer to its inevitable conclusion. The final stretch, crossing into the lush valleys of Oregon, was filled with both relief and lingering challenges. It was as if the land itself held a final test for the pioneers, one last trial to see if they truly had the endurance and the spirit to make it to the promised land. The settlers had now crossed the vast plains and the formidable Rocky Mountains, navigating treacherous rivers, enduring grueling days under the scorching sun, and suffering through sickness and disease. But as they neared Oregon, the final leg of the journey was not to be an easy one. The landscape, once so harsh and unyielding, gave way to the dense forests of the Cascade Range. Here, the mountains grew steeper, and the weather unpredictable. The settlers' hope for fertile land was close, but not without its own risks. They approached the final obstacle, the Blue Mountains. The pass, high in elevation and blanketed by thick forests, was a daunting reminder that even after enduring months of hardship, they were not yet free. The descent was rocky and perilous, and the settlers faced their last real test of strength and determination. As the wagon trains moved closer to Oregon City, the excitement that once filled their hearts slowly began to turn into a quiet reflection. There was the promise of fertile land, but many had lost family members to the harsh realities of the trail. The deaths, the sickness, and the violence of the journey had left scars. Some settlers felt the weight of the past months pressing on them. They had crossed rivers, mountains, and valleys. They had seen so many victims of disease, hunger, and misfortune. For some, reaching Oregon would mean the beginning of a new life. For others, it would be a bittersweet end to a long journey, filled with memories of those who never made it. Yet, no matter the outcome, one thing was certain: the trail had changed them all. It had shaped them in ways that no one could have foreseen when they first set out from the comfort of their homes. At long last, the settlers saw the first signs of Oregon. The landscape shifted from the rugged mountains to the fertile valleys that had been promised. The Willamette Valley, with its rich soil, was now within reach. The settlers who'd made it this far were nearly home. But even as the settlers looked toward their new life, they could not escape the legacy of the land they were about to claim. The Native American tribes that had lived on this land for centuries now faced the undeniable reality of the settlers' arrival. The promise of free land came with a price. The settlers may have been in search of opportunity, but for the indigenous tribes, the land they had called home was slipping away, piece by piece. It was not just the land that was being taken from them, it was their way of life. The riverbanks that once teemed with fish were now being diverted for irrigation. The land where they hunted and gathered was being cleared for crops. The arrival of the settlers marked the beginning of a slow and painful process of dispossession for the Native American tribes. The settlers, though, were not the only ones feeling the consequences of the journey. Many who had made it to Oregon found that the land they had been promised was not as plentiful as they had hoped. The harsh winter's unpredictable weather, and the struggle to cultivate the land made survival a constant challenge. While some thrived, others found themselves just as trapped in the cycle of survival they had fled from in the east. In the midst of the struggles of the settlers and the native tribes, the legacy of the Oregon Trail was cemented in American history. The route had opened the door to the west, fulfilling the dreams of many, but it also left behind a complex and painful history that would shape the future of the nation. The settlers' journey was both a story of perseverance and a tragic reminder of the cost of expansion. But even as the trail faded into history, its impact continued to reverberate. The Oregon Trail had changed the United States, shaping its landscape, its economy, and its identity. It had become a symbol of the American spirit, the drive to overcome obstacles, to claim new land, and to build a future. Yet it was also a reminder of the loss, the sacrifices, and the destruction that accompanied that expansion. The legacy of the Oregon Trail is multifaceted. It is a story of triumph and tragedy, of dreams realized and lives lost. It is a testament to the resilience of the settlers who braved the journey and the strength of the Native American tribes who fought to protect their land. The journey may have ended for many, but its echoes are still felt today, as the United States grapples with the consequences of its past and the ongoing efforts to understand and reconcile with that history. As the final wagon trains crossed into Oregon, there was a deep sense of relief mixed with sorrow. The journey was over, but the impact of the Oregon Trail would last for generations to come. For those who made it to the end of the trail, there was a new beginning, one that came with its own set of challenges, and for the land that had been claimed, there was no going back. The history of the Oregon Trail had shaped the United States, leaving behind both a legacy of opportunity and a reminder of the cost of expansion. With the settlers finally arriving in Oregon, the journey was over, but the trail would live on in the hearts and minds of those who made it. The trials of the Oregon Trail would be remembered, not just as a story of survival, but as a symbol of the American experience. The lessons learned from the trail, the price of progress, the sacrifices made, and the relationships built and still felt today as the nation continues to reckon with its history. The $50 commemorative coin rolls slowly across the wooden table. Its smooth edges glisten softly in the dim light, the inscription worn by time. It stops with a quiet thud, resting near an old Apple II computer, the sound of its faint hum filling the otherwise silent room. This coin, like the history it represents, has traversed through decades, its story etched into the land, much like the people who once walked across it. The legends of the past, once steeped in dust and myth, now live in machines and stories. History lies only in the desert, a phrase once spoken, now lingering on the edge of memory. But history doesn't only exist in the barren stretches of the land. It thrives in the echoes left behind by those who have passed, in the words written down, in the places still remembered. The trail is not just a path across land. It is a bridge between what was and what continues to shape us. In 1906, Ezra Meeker, a man already familiar with the grit and hardship of the Oregon Trail, retraced the steps of those who came before him. His journey wasn't just about walking the same path, it was about creating a record, a physical acknowledgement of the land and the people who had made their mark upon it. With each marker he planted, with each memento he left behind, he helped forge a connection between the past and the present. Meeker understood the importance of remembering, of preserving the spirit of the journey. His dedication led to the Oregon Trail's designation as a National Historic Trail in 1978, a recognition that ensured the stories of those who crossed it would not be lost to time. The years passed, and the landscape of the Oregon Trail began to change. The once untamed land was now dotted with interpretive centers and museums, each one a living testament to the legacy of the trail. Places like Baker City, Oregon City, Montpelier, Independence, and Gering became gateways for the public to connect with the past. The exhibits at these centers, the models and ruts on display, allowed visitors to feel the weight of history firsthand. These were not just sterile rooms filled with artifacts, they were spaces where the trail came alive, where the struggles and triumphs of the pioneers were tangible. Through these exhibits, the journey that had once been so difficult, so fraught with danger, became a story that could be experienced, a story that was now accessible to anyone willing to listen. And then, in 1971, the Oregon Trail video game was born. What started as an educational tool to teach school children about the history of westward expansion grew into something far more significant. The game, initially played on primitive teletype machines, allowed players to experience the challenges of the trail. Players were tasked with guiding a wagon train, making decisions about food, supplies, and the dangerous journey ahead. While the game was simple by today's standards, it captured something essential about the spirit of the pioneers, the uncertainty, the decisions made on the fly, the constant tension between survival and progress. The game's popularity exploded, especially in the 1980s and 1990s, as it became a cultural touchstone for a generation of children. "You have died of dysentery" became a phrase so iconic that it transcended the game itself, becoming part of popular culture. But beneath the simplicity of the game was a complex narrative, one that was both educational and deeply engaging. It opened up conversations about what it meant to be a pioneer, about the risks and sacrifices of those who made the journey west. It taught lessons that went beyond the game's interface, lessons about resilience, resourcefulness, and the spirit of exploration. However, as time passed, the Oregon Trail also became the subject of increasing scrutiny. Critics began to question the portrayal of indigenous peoples in the game, noting that it presented a simplified, often one-sided view of the westward expansion. The pioneers were cast as noble explorers, while the native populations were either ignored or depicted as obstacles to progress. The game, like many historical narratives, was built on a foundation of myths and oversimplifications. It was a story of triumph, but one that didn't fully acknowledge the cost of that triumph, the displacement and devastation of indigenous communities. In recent years, these critiques have prompted changes. The 2021 version of the Oregon Trail was reworked with the help of indigenous scholars, who provided a more nuanced perspective on the history of the trail. The updated version of the game acknowledges the pain and loss suffered by native communities during the period of westward expansion. It also emphasises the complexity of the historical narrative, showing that the trail was not simply a path of progress, but a road built on conquest, exploitation, and destruction. The game's shift reflects a broader cultural conversation about how we understand history and whose stories are told. Today, the Oregon Trail is not just a memory of pioneers crossing the plains. It is a conversation that acknowledges both the resilience of those who travelled west and the cost of that journey for the indigenous peoples who were already there. The American tradition that we celebrate today is one of multiple voices, each telling a different part of the story. It is a tradition that honours the perseverance of the pioneers while also confronting the painful legacy of their actions. It is a dialogue that recognises the past as both a source of pride and a reminder of the injustices that were inflicted upon others. As the screen flickers, the soft beep of the computer fills the room. The map of the Oregon Trail appears, the cursor blinking in the corner as if inviting you to make a choice. But this time, the choice feels different, with the knowledge of history, with the understanding of what has been lost and what has been gained. The journey is no longer just about moving forward. It is about understanding the path you're taking and what it means to walk it. The $50 coin spins lazily across the table. It catches the light, a glimmer of metal that seems to symbolise the passage of time. It slows, eventually coming to a stop, resting near the blinking Apple II, its screen glowing dimly with the faint light of a digital age long past. History lies only in the desert. The saying goes, an unspoken truth, woven into the land's dust and silence. But history is never quite as simple as we imagine. It is not confined to barren places, and it is certainly not lost in time. History is where we choose to remember. Ezra Meeker, a man who had already walked this path in his youth, retraced the Oregon Trail in 1906. His journey was not only a personal pilgrimage, it was a campaign of remembrance. His mission was to mark the trail, to leave behind physical mementos for those who might forget what came before. And it was through Meeker's efforts that the Oregon Trail was designated a National Historic Trail in 1978, recognition that ensured its place in the national consciousness, that the past would not be forgotten. Ezra Meeker's journey was just one chapter in a much broader movement to preserve the Oregon Trail's legacy. The trail became a symbol of American grit, of perseverance, and later of the price of progress. As years passed, institutions like museums and interpretive centres sprung up across the United States to preserve the story of this monumental migration. Places like Baker City, Oregon City, Montpelier, and Gearing became tangible points of connection to the past. Visitors could step into exhibitions, touch relics, see models of the wagons that once rumbled across the plains, and stand at the very spots where the trail had left its mark on the land. The story was no longer confined to the pages of history books. It was brought to life. These centres helped bridge the gap between past and present, between the people who made the journey and the generations who followed. Through these exhibitions, people could experience the hardship, the hope, and the indomitable spirit that defined the Oregon Trail. The past was no longer a distant memory. It was something you could walk through, feel, and understand. The path was alive again, not just in the soil, but in the memories of those who continued to live its story. Yet the trail's legacy wasn't confined to museums or textbooks. As the world changed, so did the way people interacted with the Oregon Trail. In 1971, the release of the Oregon Trail video game brought the history of the migration to an entirely new audience. The game, designed as an educational tool, simulated the journey westward, placing players in charge of a wagon train. They had to manage supplies, make tough decisions, and navigate the treacherous landscape. The game was more than just a lesson, it became a cultural phenomenon. The Oregon Trail wasn't just a game, it was a gateway to the past. A way for people to understand the challenges faced by pioneers in a way that textbooks never could. The phrase "you have died of dysentery" became an iconic line, echoing through the years as a meme that transcended the game itself. It became a symbol of the hardships of the trail, a reminder of the countless lives lost to the unforgiving journey. But the game did more than simply entertain, it educated. It taught generations of young people about the realities of westward expansion, the diseases, the hardships, the sacrifices, and it did so in a way that was both engaging and accessible. But as with all things, the game's simplicity also became a source of criticism. Over time, scholars and critics began to examine the Oregon Trail not just as a piece of entertainment, but as a historical artifact. They pointed out that the game, while educational, largely ignored the more complex and painful aspects of the Oregon Trail story. It presented a narrative of settlers overcoming obstacles, but it omitted the impact of that migration on the indigenous people who had lived on the land for centuries. The game, in its early versions, didn't touch on the environmental destruction, the displacement, and the violence that accompanied westward expansion. In response to this criticism, newer versions of the Oregon Trail have attempted to amend these omissions. The 2021 update, for instance, consulted indigenous scholars and made significant changes to the narrative. It sought to provide a more accurate and inclusive representation of the Oregon Trail's history, acknowledging the harm done to Native American communities and presenting their perspectives alongside those of the settlers. This shift in approach reflects a larger trend in how we view American history today, a trend that embraces complexity, recognizes the injustices of the past, and attempts to correct historical wrongs. As the cursor on the Apple II blinks, a new window opens an interactive map of the Oregon Trail, just as it would have appeared in the early days of computing. The map is simple, unadorned, but it's a window into a past that feels alive. The past isn't just something to be remembered, it's something to be re-examined, reinterpreted, and understood through the lens of new knowledge. The story of the Oregon Trail is no longer a one-sided tale of pioneers forging their way to a new life. It is a complex narrative, one that involves the stories of the indigenous peoples who were displaced, the environmental changes that were wrought, and the legacy of colonization that continues to echo through the generations. The trail, once a symbol of American triumph and determination, is now also a symbol of the cost of that triumph, a reminder that the history we celebrate must be balanced with an honest accounting of the harm it caused. As the screen flickers and the map of the trail stretches across the screen, it's clear that the story of the Oregon Trail is still unfolding. The past is not something set in stone. It's something we continue to engage with, to question, and to learn from. And as the map invites us to choose, to select our path, it's a reminder that the choices we make today will shape the history of tomorrow. The soft hum of the computer fills the room, the faint sound of typing echoes, a quiet rhythm that mirrors the journey of those who once travelled the Oregon Trail. The story is far from over, and as the cursor blinks, it beckons us to continue the journey, one of discovery, understanding, and reflection. The $50 coin, still warm from its spin, now rests quietly on the table next to the Apple II. Time itself seems to pause, caught between the glint of the coin and the soft glow of the screen. The beeping sound of the machine cuts through the silence, the digital age calling forth memories of the past, but also beckoning the future. History, like the Oregon Trail itself, is not static. It does not live in a vacuum. The trail's memory is alive, constantly evolving, constantly being re-examined. The digital age, with all its tools and conveniences, has opened up new ways to explore the past, but it has also forced us to confront old narratives that we once accepted as truth. Ezra Meeker's efforts to preserve the trail were critical, yes, but they also marked the beginning of a broader conversation. In his time, the memory of the Oregon Trail was about commemoration, about remembering the grit and perseverance of those who journeyed westward. Meeker's markers were tangible evidence that this part of American history was worth preserving. The National Historic Trail designation in 1978 was another acknowledgement of the importance of remembering the trail, but it was also a nod to the way history could be shaped by those who had the power to remember. But how much of that history should we cling to? How much of it should be rewritten? Or perhaps even forgotten? The new digital era has changed the way we interact with history. The maps and diagrams we once used to trace the trail now exist as interactive interfaces, where anyone can choose to follow the path from the safety of their own home. But in doing so, we risk forgetting the very real hardships that once made those roads treacherous. And in doing so, we risk losing sight of the complexities of the journey, the displacement of indigenous peoples, the environmental destruction, the lives lost along the way. The museums and interpretive centres that now dot the landscape are another way we preserve this memory. They offer a space for reflection and learning, allowing visitors to physically touch and see the remnants of the trail. In Baker City, Oregon, at the National Historic Oregon Trail Interpretive Center, you can walk through exhibits that show you what it was like to be on the trail, to experience the life of a pioneer, the dangers they faced, the choices they made. These centers give a sense of proximity to the past. They allow you to step into the shoes of someone who made that difficult journey, and they offer visitors a chance to feel the weight of history. But while these museums help bring the past closer, They also raise the question, how do we ensure that history is told with all of its complexities? As much as we may celebrate the pioneers, we must also recognise the costs of their journey. In modern times, the Oregon Trail has become a symbol of American perseverance, but it is also a symbol of colonisation, of the destruction of indigenous cultures, of the forced removal of peoples from their ancestral lands. As we look at the artefacts of the past, we must ask ourselves who gets to tell the story, and who is left out. In recent years, the conversation around the Oregon Trail has shifted. Newer versions of the Oregon Trail video game, for example, have made efforts to address the historical inaccuracies and biases that were present in earlier iterations. The 2021 release consulted Indigenous scholars to help reshape the narrative, offering a more nuanced view of the trail's impact. The game, which was once a cultural phenomenon, now attempts to give a more balanced view of history, acknowledging the perspective of Native American communities who were deeply affected by westward expansion. This shift is a reflection of a broader trend in how we understand history today. It is no longer enough to simply celebrate the triumphs of the past. We must also confront the injustices that were part of that history. The digital age, with its new tools for exploration and its ability to reach a vast audience, has made this kind of introspection more possible than ever. It allows us to hold space for multiple perspectives, to recognise that the past was not a singular story, but a tapestry of different voices, each with its own truth. And so, as the map on the Apple II flickers and the cursor blinks, we are reminded that history is not something we simply look back on. It is something we engage with, actively and thoughtfully. The Oregon Trail, once a symbol of westward expansion, has now become a space for reflection and dialogue. It is a place where we can come to terms with the past, acknowledge the pain and the progress, and ask ourselves how we want to move forward. The sound of the keyboard echoes in the quiet room, a reminder of the way technology has transformed the way we engage with the past. The digital landscape invites us to make new choices, to rewrite history with the knowledge we now possess. The past is not a static thing, a series of events that simply happened and are now over. It's a living, breathing conversation that we continue to have with ourselves. As the screen fills with a new map of the Oregon Trail, it is not just a map of land and routes. It is a map of the conversations we have today, the conversations that allow us to challenge the narratives we once accepted, to see the complexity of history in all its painful beauty. The beeping of the machine fades as the screen shows a new set of options. The cursor blinks, inviting us to choose once again. With every click, with every choice, we continue the story of the Oregon Trail not just as it was, but as we understand it today, and that understanding, though ever evolving, is one of the most important legacies we can leave. The cursor still blinks on the screen, the faint echo of the computer's hum hanging in the air. The story of the Oregon Trail, though wrapped in layers of myth and history, continues to unfold. The map, once a simple guide for pioneers, now serves as a crossroads for our understanding, a place where the past and present meet, where the weight of history is not merely remembered, but reflected upon. As the $50 coin, now cold to the touch, rests beside the Apple II, the story reminds us that history is not a relic, but a living, breathing conversation. It is a conversation that we're all part of, a dialogue shaped by the choices we make today, as much as by the choices of those who came before us. The Oregon Trail is no longer just a journey of wagons and dreams of land. It is a symbol of human persistence, yes, but also of the cost of progressive lands lost, of cultures erased, of lives sacrificed. As we revisit the trail, through history, through the museums, through the digital landscape, we are invited to confront its full meaning, to question what it means to move forward, and at what cost. The sound of the keyboard fades, the beeping stops, and the screen dims to black. But the story lingers, as all stories do, not in the static remnants of a map, not in the sterile facts of a game, but in the ongoing conversation we carry with the past. A conversation that calls us to remember, to learn, and to grow. The Oregon Trail is a history in motion, and we are its next chapter.